but I'll do this for now. Okay, so we got a lot to get through, so let's get started. So, we talked a lot about HTTP so far, kind of how the protocol behind the web works. So talking about how we actually create websites. So HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. It's a similar hypertext protocol or hypertext transfer protocol as the protocol for sending hypertext. This is the protocol or the markup language for creating hypertext, so they're kind of related. HTML provides the structure and the content of a web page. We also have CSS, which stands for Cascading Style Sheets, and that's what provides the styling of your website. And then we have JavaScript, which is a scripting language, provides interactivity. So anything that any animations, well, some animations can be CSS, but things that you click on, anything having to do with data, anything having to do with interacting with APIs, anything that's functional, anything that's doing calculations or logic, that's all going to be JavaScript. So we have this nice breakout of kind of the structure and content, and then we have the style, and then we have the behavior or the interactivity. Those are all three separate branches. So your browser downloads the HTML. So in that HTTP request, the response from the server is your HTML. And then the HTML itself includes links to your CSS and your JavaScript. So the HTML provides that information to your browser. Okay, here's a CSS file. Go download that and include it. Here's a JavaScript file. Go download that and include it. So the HTML is the main thing that gets returned back from the server, and it includes the links to the other parts. One thing to talk about a little bit is static sites, which is what we'll be making in class. Actually, we'll do some dynamic stuff with front end, when we get into React. But static sites are just HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files. There's no, server-side rendering, building templates, or anything. They're just files that you access and they load. A dynamic site is what we call something that uses some sort of software to generate the HTML for you. So if you've heard of like WordPress, that's a dynamic site, or like Java, or if you're using like Spring Framework or something like that, or PHP, any of these back-end web languages, that what they do is they process some data, process some requests, and then they generate the HTML and then return the HTML. So again, we're mostly going to be working with static sites, just HTML files. But anytime you're working with at least server-side rendered, as we call it, applications, you're going to have dynamic sites where there's some sort of programming language on the server that's building the HTML as you go, typically using some sort of template language. And so that way it's dynamic. It has to do with whatever the request is. It'll build the HTML for that request on demand. So like PHP or ASP.NET, Java, Ruby, Python, all of those kinds of things are handling the more dynamic side of things. One thing to talk about too is WYSIWYG site builder. So WYSIWYG stands for what you see is what you get. You get kind of an interface, sort of like Microsoft Word or something, where you can type and you can draw, you can move stuff around and kind of build the website exactly how you want it to look. So there's some software for this, like Adobe Dreamweaver. I'm sure there's newer ones. That's kind of old school. Or something like Wix.com or Squarespace. You may have used these. They're great options for someone who's not familiar with technical things at all. Not if you don't know any HTML, you can build a website using Wix or something like that. Sometimes they have plugins for dynamic features. I have a buddy who started a business selling some products, and he didn't know anything about web development, but he was able to use Wix to build a shopping cart and a checkout system, and it was easy. Like just kind of click and plug and play, and he was able to sell stuff, and people can pay him over the over his website. Pretty cool for someone who doesn't have any technical ability to be able to do that. It's kind of nice. However, there are a lot of cons. They're very limited. You're provided just with what they give you. It's a very kind of walled garden approach. You can only work within the confines of what they've created. It can be really difficult to update. So that's one of the things I run into a lot, with freelance clients that I'll work with. They'll be like, oh, why can't we just use Wix or something like that? It's like, well, if you want to update things, you have to go through Wix's interface. You have to log in. You have to find the content you want to update, and you have to type it and change it. You don't get any sort of content management So like you can't like some of them may have blog features, but like with WordPress or something, even you have like a blog where you can create new blog, and you've got a nice interface for creating a blog. Or having more of a content management oriented thing. Whereas with Wix or Squarespace, you have to find the page you want to edit and click to edit it, and it's just a little bit more cumbersome. They also don't generate very clean code. So like I said, if you use Wix or Squarespace for one of your class assignments, we can tell really, really easily because the HTML is kind of crazy. The CSS is even worse. It's really obvious because, again, they're made to kind of be able to serve any type of situation. They're meant to be drag and drop. So you can imagine the code that they generate is not very clean. It's kind of messy. So again, there's some pros and cons. I recommend these sometimes. If I have a friend who owns a small business, and he's like, hey, I want a website. What's the best way to do it? I was like, just go to Wix.com. It'll take you a couple hours, and you can put something together. Super easy. This is kind of what it looks like. Like this is Wix. Again, you can just, if you want to change this text, you just click on it and change it and change the font or whatever. Super easy to use. This is what like Dreamweaver will look like. So you'll kind of get like a visual representation. Dreamweaver at least will show you your HTML, and you can kind of edit things. You can even see your DOM over here. So it has, a little bit more developer-oriented features for sure. But it's still a little bit limited. There's also content management systems, which are good to be familiar with. So it's software that gives you a system to manage your content. So you can usually add themes even, and then it'll generate the actual pages for you. So examples of like WordPress or Drupal, even like Tumblr is kind of a content management system. So again, if you go to WordPress and you log in, and you can see your blog posts, and you can like create new blog posts, and it gives you the fields you need to fill out. It's really simple. It lets you just manage your content, and then it displays it for you on the website. So again, there's some pros, easy to manage content. Like if I have a friend who's like, hey, I want to start blogging, I'm like, go to WordPress.com, sign up, it's easy. Really nice for really specific use cases. Again, they usually have plug-and-play themes. You can even buy themes that are fancy and look great. It's usually easy to add plugins for added functionality, so there's a lot of pros there. Again, some cons, it can be difficult to set up, especially if you want to host it yourself. It can be kind of crazy. Also limiting in features. Again, you're dealing with kind of a walled garden approach where they've built something that's a platform and like a framework that you can use, but you're limited to what they've built for you and kind of the paths they've enabled for you to use. This is kind of what WordPress looks like. So again, you add new posts, you've got the post fields, super easy to do. So now I've told you all the easy ways to make websites. Why are we learning HTML and CSS? So again, there's lots of options for easy and configurable websites. Really, they all boil down though to using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Like Wix.com, it's generating HTML behind the scenes from your drag and drop interface. They're all using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So understanding these technologies, one, helps us use these tools more effectively. If you learn web development well, you learn CSS, and you go and I've worked professionally on WordPress sites, because if you know CSS, you can customize them way more than they allow you to out of the box. You can usually add your own CSS. You can even dig into the actual files under the hood and edit themes and templates and stuff. So knowing these technologies helps you use those tools a lot more effectively. Also, hopefully we can build our own, right? Like, we want to learn to do cool stuff. We don't want to stick with just tools people have built. So learning HTML, CSS, and JavaScript lets us build those tools and make them better. So again, stuff like Wix, Squarespace, WordPress, whatever, great options for non-technical people that can deal with really limited options. But if we're wanting to do cool stuff, we're probably going to have to break out of those confines and do just our raw HTML and CSS. Okay, so HTML. It was invented in 1989 by Tim Berners-Lee at CERN. If you guys have heard of CERN, it's a large particle collider. Kind of interesting, that I only really mentioned this in the history. It's interesting to me how, he was a scientist, not really, this was kind of the beginnings of the internet. they developed HTML as a way for academics to transfer data back and forth and to transfer academic papers and research back and forth in the very early stages of the internet. They didn't really have, they sort of had like a really rudimentary form of email back then, but they didn't have kind of a more formal way of formatting documents that could be transferred over the internet. So it's kind of created out of the need for that. They were, obviously at CERN, they were generating lots of research. So HTML was the way they came up with kind of a standard format that all the scientists agreed on. Okay, we'll write our research documents in HTML. It lets us kind of have this common language that we can use to share information. The HTML specification is maintained by the W3C, which is made up of industry leaders, from all kinds of companies, Google, Microsoft, government officials, nonprofit leaders. They're the ones that kind of maintain the standards, and it's an evolving standard. So HTML4, which is kind of the sort of the current version, we're sort of in between versions right now, but HTML4 was finalized around 1999. HTML5 has been finalized for about 3 years, but it's been a year since I wrote the slide. Browsers are still kind of catching up to support it. At this point, HTML5 has pretty much, I think you have to go back to older versions of IE, like 8 or 9 even. I think 10 supports most HTML5 features. So if you hear about HTML5, and we'll talk about some HTML5 features a little bit later, generally it's pretty safe to use HTML5 at this point for the most part. So I haven't really heard much about what's next after HTML5, so we'll see. So again, it's an evolving standard. They're always kind of changing. They're adding new features, so something to keep in mind. And if you ever have questions about, really precisely how you're supposed to do something in HTML, look up the W3C's website. They have a full specification. You can even look at what the proposals are for the next version. It's really interesting to see what kinds of things they're thinking. So again, HTML is a specification that then the browsers implement. So it's kind of an agreement amongst all the browsers. Okay, this is what features that HTML will have. This is what kinds of tags you can use. And they all kind of agree on this. So there's, it's not, the W3C doesn't really provide any software. They just provide these huge, long documents that go in extreme detail about what HTML is and what all the tags are. And then it's up to the browsers to actually write the software to render it. Okay, so again, because HTML has evolved over time, the doc type is a way to indicate which version of HTML the browser should use when rendering your page. So the doc type looks like this. HTML5 makes the doc type really easy. It's just doc type HTML. So it's a nice change they made. For some reason they decided, and it's supposed to be more backwards compatible now, so they decided they didn't really need the version number. So all you have to do now is doc type HTML. It should be the very, very first thing in your HTML file. Before any blank lines, the very first thing is the doc type. And it's just to tell the browser, when the browser receives the response, in theory, that response could be JSON data, it could be text, it could be something else, but you want to tell it, hey, this is HTML, so render it as such. HTML4 doc type looked like this, so again, it's a really nice change that they simplified it quite a bit. So you used to have to kind of link the version, HTML4 here is the version we're using. They also used to have different standards. They had like a loose standard where you could kind of get away with some errors that they would be okay, or there was a strict standard where you had to be really precise in your formatting. So again, doc type HTML is what we will use. Comments in HTML. So this is how we do comments in HTML. So a little bit different if you use Java or some other programming language. Usually it's 2 slashes. HTML uses the angle brackets and an exclamation point and then 2 dashes. So again, we want to add comments in our code quite a bit. They don't show up on our page, but they're ways for us to put notes for ourselves, ways for us to designate different sections of our HTML. So when we come back later, or if someone else comes and looks at your HTML, is trying to add something or trying to understand what you were thinking when you did a certain thing, comments are a really great way to inform that future user of what you were thinking, what was going on. Or even your future self. Sometimes you will forget what you're thinking. Having a comment in there is really nice. One note is that comments can be seen if you do view source on a website. So if you go to any website, you can do view source and see the HTML. You can see the comments in there. So keep in mind, don't put anything sensitive in the comments. The number one thing hackers check for when they're trying to hack into a website is there a password in the comments? And you'd be surprised how often that works. There was a big deal hack that recently happened. I can't remember which one it was. One of the ones in the last year that ended up being that. There was a comment that had a default password or something like that somewhere, and that's what the hackers used to get into it. So don't put any sensitive information. Again, also commenting out a line of your HTML is a good way to kind of temporarily remove it. You can comment it out, save it. It'll disappear from your site, but you still have it there for reference if you want to undo it. Most editors, if you use like command/ or control/, you can like highlight some code and hit command/ and it'll comment it out for you. So it's really handy. So you don't even have to remember the exact formatting sometimes. Okay, so what does the HTML look like? Again, it stands for Hypertext Markup Language. The word markup there is kind of important for understanding how HTML is used. The idea is that you're taking some data, you're taking a document, and you're marking it up with the structure and with the formatting. So you're adding tags around content to kind of provide some structure to it. If you just had a big wall of text, that's not very readable, right? Just a big long string of text. But if you add line breaks and you add some paragraph breaks and you add some headings, that starts to make it make a little bit more sense. It's easier to read. So that's what we're doing with HTML is we're marking up that data or that content with the structure and with the style. So again, it's used to describe the structure of a web page. It's composed of elements, which can include an opening tag and a closing tag. So the element is the entire thing, the opening tag, the content, and the closing tag. And then the tags are the part that are at the beginning and the end of the elements. You can tell the closing tag, it usually has a slash at the beginning of it. So here's an example. Again, the whole thing is an element. Here's our opening tag. So you can tell tags, they have the angle brackets, and then whatever the name of the tag is. And we'll talk about these. There's only certain options you can put here. You can't just kind of do whatever. So there are certain types of tags that we'll use. So then you have the contents of your tag. So that's your text or your data, your information, whatever it is that's going inside of that element. Then you have your ending tag, and again, it has a slash at the beginning, which indicates that it's a closing tag. So opening tag, contents, closing tag, the whole thing is an element. Questions? All right. So web page structure. So ultimately, web pages, like I said, are documents made up of tons of different elements. So we've got like headings and paragraphs and lists. These pages contain a hierarchy of information typically. So you've got headings and subheadings. You've got lists with nested lists. You think of like a newspaper article or something like that, or even just a newspaper itself. It's got sections for different articles. Each article has like a title and a byline and maybe a subtitle and then some paragraphs and an image, maybe a footer, those kinds of things. Even a book, has a certain structure to it. So HTML is the way that we provide that structure. So when we think about HTML, you really want to think about a document. You're editing a document. And it may be laid out, however, you might have columns, you might move stuff around, but ultimately you're editing a document of information. So again, the tags surround the content and give it structure. Elements are nested within each other as well. So you may have a paragraph. Inside that paragraph may be some, strong tags emphasizing, some strong words. You might have a list that contains paragraphs. You can nest elements inside of each other. So first we have kind of some structure tags that will be on every HTML page. So first, the entire web page is wrapped by the HTML tag. So after your doc type is your HTML tag that just says, I'm starting my HTML. After the HTML tag comes the head tag, which contains some header information about your page. Everything inside the head tag doesn't actually appear on the page. You're just providing some meta information that the browser uses in different ways. So the most important one, and the required one, is a title tag, which goes inside the head, and it gives the page a title which shows up in the title bar of your browser. So for instance, up here at the top, my browser in the window, you see CSE 204, Lecture 02, that comes from the title tag. So that's how you have that show up there. If you're using, tabs, it'll show up in the tab, as the title of that tab. So that comes from the title tag. After the closing head, so after your head tag comes the body tag, which wraps everything that actually appears in the browser window, so the body of your page. All of your content goes inside the body tag. All of these tags are required in every HTML page, so they're required by the specification that you have an HTML, you have a head, a title, and a body. Sometimes if you leave like a title out, your page will still work, but you're not technically going to be up to spec because Chrome or whatever won't know what to put up in the tab. I think I have an example. Yeah. So here's like a bare minimum HTML page, what it would look like. So you've got your HTML tag at the very top. Really, we should have a doc type, but I left it off here. So we've got your HTML tag. Then we've got our head tag nested inside that with our title inside of our head. Then we close our head tag and we start our body tag. We've got here like a heading, and a paragraph, and a list. Then we close our body and we close our HTML. So again, the body is what will actually show up in the browser window. I don't think I mentioned it on the slides anywhere, but this kind of indenting is a really, really good idea. Really good idea. You really should do it. Anytime a tag is inside of another tag, indent it over whatever your indent settings are. I think I use 4 spaces, but indent it over. It helps visually. It helps you see the structure of your HTML a lot better. It helps you catch missing tags a lot easier. If things are kind of indented, you'll say, wait, there's a bigger jump here than there should be. That means you probably missed a closing tag. It's just a really good way to structure your HTML. I can't tell you how many times I've helped students, they've got some problem with their website, and they'll pull up their HTML, and it's kind of like everything's all the way on the left, or everything's all in one line, and tags are kind of all mixed together, and it's like, okay, first thing you need to do is fix your indentation, because that's going to help us see the problem a lot easier. If you've got, if you missed a closing body tag, or even, if you miss like this closing header tag, all of this is going to be also considered a header, and it's going to look really weird. But if you don't have things structured well, it's going to be really easy to miss. So indent any tags inside of other tags. Yeah, question?
The head tag, which contains info about the page, what other info does it contain?
Yeah, it's a good question. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but there's meta tags that you can put in there that kind of provide maybe some information for search engines, stuff like that. You can also include like your links to your CSS will go in the head tag, stuff like that. So we'll kind of cover some of those as we go. It's a good question. The bare minimum, though, is the title. Every page should have a title. Okay, so we're talking about elements. There's also what are called element attributes. So they provide some additional information about the contents of an element. They appear inside the opening tag, and they have a name and a value. And the value will be wrapped in quotes. We'll talk about these a little bit later when we talk about ID and class. Those are the main attributes we'll use in class. So generally, these attributes have no practical effect. A few of them will when we get into forms and stuff like that. But typically, they're used by your CSS or your JavaScript to modify the behavior or to modify the style of your elements. So it's a way to add some additional attributes to the elements. So this is what it looks like. So you've got your tag name, then we'll have a space, and then the attribute name equals, and then whatever the value of the attribute is. We'll kind of come back to this a little bit later when we talk about ID and class. But here's a few examples. You may have even used a style attribute. So if we have, our body is our tag name, and then style is the name of our attribute, and this is the value that goes inside of that attribute. So you may have used this. Really, we shouldn't use style attributes anymore. So if you use that for your first assignment for the extra credit points, that's okay. But typically, we'll be using CSS to give style information and not doing it with the style attribute. It is it may not be valid at some point. They're kind of discouraging you from using it. Because if you think about it, if you put the style tag tons of places, if you want to change anything, you have to go find every place you set that style. Whereas if we use CSS, we can do it in a lot cleaner, more flexible way. So anyway, don't use style tag, but it's an example of how you can use those attributes. We'll talk more about ID and class, but these are good examples of attributes. Images use like a source and an alt attribute. So again, that's kind of how we can add additional information to our HTML tags. Okay, viewing HTML source. So if you do view source in your browser, it allows you to see the HTML of any website. It's really nice. So if you're in Chrome, highlight it for you on the page, stuff like that. You can see dimensions, you can see style information associated with that element. So view, developer, view tools. Usually you can right-click on anything on a web page and do inspect element, and it'll open up the inspector for you. So again, game changer for web development. We didn't have this when I started doing web development, and it was really hard. And this almost feels like cheating because you can edit things, you can change style. Like now, if I'm working on a web page, I pull up developer tools and do most of the work inside developer tools for like the style. Then once I have it looking how I want, I just copy that CSS that I wrote and paste in my CSS file. It's the best way to do it. You can do it live. You see the effects. Really, really nice. Here's what developer tools looks like. So again, you see your HTML over here. You can see all the elements. Over here on the right, you see the styles that are applied. You even see what HTML rules they come from. You can see what HTML or CSS files. You can like check them to remove them. Really crazy. Here's another example of HTML. I don't know why that's in there. Okay, so text elements. So text elements will provide the structure to the text in our page. The content inside of these text elements that we look at should really only be text. They're meant to just wrap text information. The browser by default will provide really minimal styling for text elements, so typically it's more a structure thing. We're providing some structure to our text, and then we'll fill in the gaps and add style later with our CSS. So some examples are like headings and paragraphs. So headings look like this. They use H1 through H6 are the different levels of headings that we have. H1 being the largest, used for main headings, H6 being the smallest. Headings are designed to be structured, so you shouldn't have an H2 on your page unless there's an H1 that it's a subheading of. Does that make sense? So you don't use it to determine the size that you want. Use it really specifically for the structure of your page. So don't just have an H2 out of nowhere without it being subsequent to an H1 somewhere along the line. So for example, like this heading up here where it says headings would be an H1. We don't have any other headings on the page, but if we did, they would be H2s if there are subheadings. An H3 should be a subheading of an H2, so on and so forth. So again, we'll talk about this more, when we get into CSS, but don't choose the level of heading based on what size you want it. Typically, the browsers make H1 the largest and H6 the smallest. You don't want to choose the heading level based on the size. You can adjust the size with CSS. If you want your heading 1s to be smaller, you can change that with CSS. So don't just make them all H2s in order to get them to be smaller. Leave them as H1s. We'll change the size with CSS. We're worried about the structure of our content. And if they're H1s, they should be H1. Paragraph tags will wrap individual paragraphs of text. So the paragraphs will be separated by a line break and a little bit of margin. So if you have a giant wall of text and you start wrapping paragraphs in paragraph tags, that will give each paragraph its own new line, and also will kind of separate them a little bit to help them look better. Bold and italic. I'll talk about an alternative to these in a little bit, but the B tag will make text appear bold by default, and I will make it appear italic. Again, there's a better alternative that's kind of the more modern approach to doing bold and italic, so we'll talk about that in a little bit, but it's good to know what the B and the I tag do. Superscript and subscript can be used to do superscript or subscript. Pretty self-explanatory. White space is important to talk about. So your web browser will collapse white space in your HTML document. So, say you have two paragraph tags, and you hit enter a bunch of times to create a bunch of new lines in between those paragraph tags. Your browser does not care how things are spaced out in your HTML. The browser will collapse that white space. So you can put spaces however you want in your HTML. It doesn't really matter. The browser collapses all that. Really, your HTML in the end can all just be one big long line. It doesn't need any actual spaces as far as like new lines in it, because your HTML elements provide that information about what should be on new lines, etc. So it's really, really important to remember that. Even more than one space, like spacebar space, will be ignored. So if you have some content, you hit spacebar a bunch of times, your web browser is going to collapse that all into one space, as well as line breaks. You can manually insert a new line using a break tag. So BR and then slash. We'll talk about what that is. We talk about right here. Use break tags really sparingly. We probably shouldn't ever see them in your assignments. It's kind of cheating a little bit, because if you're having to manually add a line break, typically it means that you've not thought through your content well enough, or you're not using CSS properly, and you're just kind of manually adding break tags. Certainly if you have more than one break tag, you definitely are doing something incorrectly. Or at least there's a better way to do it, because those break tags, if you want to change that spacing later, you're going to have to remove one. You can't really adjust the sizing of break tags. It's just a messy way to do things. I've used them a few times. Like if you've got some elements or you've got some text and you really want a line break and there's no other way to do it with CSS, you can add a break tag. But again, use it really, really sparingly. Definitely never use multiple break tags to create a big empty space. If you're doing that, you're doing it wrong. HR, you can use sparingly also, but it'll insert a line break and a horizontal line. So HR is good to kind of separate different sections of your site maybe. So it'll actually draw, a horizontal line, and you can adjust the properties of that line. You can change what it looks like. By default, it's like kind of an inset looking line usually. So you can use that. Break and HR, which stands for horizontal rule, by the way. They're known as empty elements or self-closing tags. You notice there's no opening tag and then closing tag. It's because it's both the opening and the closing tag at the same time. So anytime you see a tag like this, whereas the tag name and then a slash, it's what we call a self-closing tag or an empty tag. And it's because there's no content that goes inside of it, right? A line break doesn't have any words inside of it. It's just a line break. It kind of stands on its own. So it doesn't really need an opening and closing tag because it's not wrapping any information. It just kind of stands on its own. Okay, questions about line breaks. Okay, like I said, when we get into CSS, we'll talk about how to space your content out. So it's, you don't have to, deal with, content that's not spaced out properly. You can space it out properly, but we'll do so with CSS, which is a lot better way to do it. Okay, so that kind of covers, there's some other text elements that you can use, but those are kind of the main examples of elements that are just wrapping text, that are just giving structure to your text. Semantic elements are not necessarily intended to be structural, but they add meaning to the content. So there are ways, semantic means meaning. There are ways to add some sort of context to what the content means. Some of them will have some default styling and they can be customized further. But the primary purpose of these elements is not adding style. So you should only be used when they're enhancing the meaning of the content, not just to get it to look a certain way. Does that make sense? Because then we'll use our CSS to adjust the style. We're really just concerned with the meaning here. So for example, if you want to make a heading bold, so you've got some heading to the page and you want to make it bold, don't just use strong, we'll talk about it in a second, but use a heading tag and then style it to be bold. Because strong, should be used to emphasize the meaning, not the structure, not the, structure of our content. If it's a heading, it should really be a heading tag. We can adjust how it looks later. So some examples are strong and emphasis, quotations, abbreviations, that kind of thing. So here's strong and emphasis. These are the better ways to do bold and italics. So like the bold tag and the italic tag, they'll change the way it looks, but they don't really tell you anything about the content other than it should look bold and it should look italic. And there's better ways to make things bold and italic now with our CSS. Bold and italic tags are from an older version of HTML where they weren't as concerned about separating the content and the style. So they're kind of going away. They'll probably be deprecated at some point if they aren't already. I'm sure they'll be supported for a while, but anyway, strong is a better way of indicating that text should be bold. If you think about it, strong it's a more semantic, it has more meaning to it, and you could style it different ways. You could style something strong, it could be bold, it could be a different color. There's multiple ways that you could make text appear stronger. So by default, though, the browser's style is bold, same as the bold tag. M stands for emphasis. It should indicate that content has emphasis. It kind of changes the meaning of a sentence. So, you know, I think Ivy was the first, or I think Ivy was the first, or I think Ivy was the first. It kind of changes the way that sentence is read. So the emphasis tag is a way to indicate where that emphasis should go. By default, the browsers will style it the same as italic. But again, can be multiple ways to visually represent that emphasis. It could be a different color. It could be, you know, it could even be bold maybe. You know, like there's different ways that you may choose to style that sort of semantic tag. So again, preferred to use those rather than bold or italic. These are newer HTML5 elements too as well, by the way. Quotations is another example of semantic elements. So, you know, they're not necessarily used for structure, but they're providing some context, some meaning to some of your content. So you can use block quote for longer quotes that may take an entire paragraph. So you may still need to use a paragraph tag inside of a block quote. Again, the block quote is not necessarily giving you the structure. It's just saying this, you know, content is a quote. You can use Q for shorter quotes that will sit in line within a paragraph. So here's an example. Oh, and you can also use the cite attribute to, you know, provide your citation for your quote. So here's an example of block quote. So we've got our opening block quote. We've got our cite. So we're quoting this from Wikipedia. Then inside it, we've got our regular content. Paragraph tag. You can have multiple paragraph tags because a block quote could be multiple paragraphs. And then you close your block quote. There's an example of that. Questions so far? Okay. Abbreviations. We'll run through these real quick. So abbreviations you'd use for like an acronym or an abbreviation. So like professor, if you just shorten it as prof. You can use the title attribute to give the full meaning. Typically, in your browser, if you hover over it, it will pop up and it'll show you what the full term is. You can also use cite to list a reference. Typically, it will be italic by default, but again, you can change that. DFN is also a way to indicate when you're defining a term for the first time. So if you're, you know, in like Wikipedia or something, you may indicate, hey, I'm providing the definition of a term now. So you would give it, like in a textbook, you'll see it'll be bold, typically in the sentence that's defining it. That's a way you can indicate that. Here's some more. You can use address, which is the only one we'll really talk about here, which can be used to wrap either a physical address or a phone number or a web URL or an email address. Anything that's indicating that this is an address where you can contact or find more information or something like that. So you can use it for all kinds of content. It's just a way to say this is an address. There's insert and delete and strike through. Strike through is kind of handy sometimes if you want to, you know, indicate that something's been, it'll have a line through it. So you can come back to these and look at them some more if you want. So that's kind of most of the semantic elements. There's some more we'll cover here at the end of kind of more structural semantic elements, but those are kind of the bulk of the important ones that we'll use for the most part. So lists. We don't have time. 20. Lists are pretty important. We use lists a lot in websites, even if it's just a bulleted list that's not numbered or something like that. Most websites have some sort of list on them. So there's different types of lists that we can create. So first is ordered list, where each item begins with a number. So if it's like a recipe steps or a table of contents, something like that, that's numbered 1, 2, 3, 4. There's also unordered lists, which are just a bullet point. So they're not not necessarily any order information. It doesn't matter what order they are necessarily. They just have a bullet point. We also have definition lists, which are terms with corresponding definitions. One important thing is that lists can be nested inside of each other. So you could have an ordered list where each item of the ordered list is a bulleted list, right? Like you can kind of mix and match how those work. So you can have sublists, that type of thing. Same that you would do in Word or something like that if you're taking, outline notes of a lecture or something like that. So ordered lists are created with OL elements, and then LI wraps each item of the list. So we have our entire OL here, which starts and ends, and it wraps both of our subsequent items. LI is used for well-ordered and unordered lists. So you can always remember OL, ordered list, LI is list item. So it'll automatically number each one. So we don't have to actually type like 1 and then 2. The browser will automatically say, okay, we have an ordered list, here's our first item, and it'll prefix it with 1. You can change in CSS how that prefixing works, what it looks like. You can change it from like numbers to Roman numerals or something like that if you want. But all we're worried about here is indicating that it's an ordered list. Here's what an unordered list looks like. So very, very similar. Instead of OL, we have UL for unordered list. And then we have our bullet points. By default, they use like the little circle bullet point. You can change that. You can even provide your own images if you want for each bullet point. But the main thing is that we're providing unordered list information. Definition lists are a little bit different. So you use DL to wrap the entire thing, since we're definition list. Then inside of that, you have pairs of term and definition. So we use DT for the term, and then we use DD for the definition. So I don't really like the way these work because they're just next to each other. It's a little bit messy in my opinion, but this is the way that it works. So you provide the term, then you provide the definition right after that. You can provide like multiple terms and multiple definitions if you wanted to do certain things, move them around. I always like to have them one after the other, and then mess with CSS to get them structured how I want. Typically, the definition is indented to the right a little bit. So by default, this is kind of how it will look. So you'll have HTML, and then your term will be kind of indented. So these are, I try and use these, whenever I have terms and corresponding, information that goes along with it. Even like if you have like a table of contents and you have like chapters and then like a description of the chapter or something like that, I might use a DT or a DL for. So it just kind of depends on your use case whether or not it makes sense or not. Again, you can style it however you want. But what's nice about this is it links those two things together. You could just have each of these be like a paragraph or whatever. But because you've got them linked together in this way, it provides a lot of benefits, including for screen readers. So like a screen reader will know, it'll even read, definition term is HTML. Definition is hypertext markup language. It'll read that aloud to the user. So if you had just, typed HTML and then new line or a break tag, if you type HTML break tag, hypertext markup language, break tag, CSS, break tag, it would provide the same, style effect, but it doesn't provide the user any information about the data that you're giving them. So a screen reader would just see HTML, hypertext markup language. It wouldn't actually tell them what it is. So that's why we want to use the proper elements for whatever the structure of our data is. One of the huge benefits of screen readers, it gives them some more contextual information about what they're hearing. So really important to use the right elements. Links. So we use an A element to create links. The content between the opening tag and the closing tag is the clickable part of the link, so the part that we actually click on. And then we use an href attribute to indicate the page the link should take you to. So for example, if we have a link to Google, we've got our A tag, we've got our href attribute, which is google.com, and then click here, and then our closing A tag. So click here is the part that we'll actually see and the part we can click on. By default, they're styled blue and underlined usually, and then once you've clicked on them once, if you revisit the page, you'll see it'll be purple because you've already clicked on it. And again, we can adjust that with our CSS, including what happens after we've clicked it. That's all adjustable. Questions on links? One quick note to talk about is the difference between absolute URLs and relative URLs. So absolute URLs are, they'll include the full web address. So it includes the HTTP and the domain name. It's a full absolute URL, typically linking to an external page. So if you're on, washu.edu and there's a, link to Google, it's probably going to be it will have to be an absolute URL. By contrast, a relative URL is relative to the current page that you're on. So it means that it's a link to a page on the same domain that you're on, and then it can be, relative depending on what the folder structure is. So it's kind of a more shorthand way of doing it. So for example, if you just had href of aboutus.html, when you click on that, it's going to go to whatever website you're on /aboutus.html. Yeah, question?
Why does the first A not have a closing thing right after it?
This one?
No, the first one.
What do you mean?
The first A.
Up here? So the href provides the URL, and then there's a closing, and then the closing A. All right, did I miss something?
Okay, so it should be the second one shouldn't be right after the A.
No, you provide whatever gets clicked on inside the tag. Does that make sense? Did I do something wrong? Okay, all right, cool. Yeah, so the href provides the link, and then whatever is visible, and then your closing tag. So again, if you're on washu.edu and there's an A tag that says aboutus.html, it will go to washu.edu/aboutus.html. Makes sense? So usually you're using that for links within the same website. There's also a few other things you can do with relative URLs it's relative to your current page. So, aboutus.html will just go to /aboutus.html. You could also include a child folder. So if you're on washu.edu and you link to, subpages /aboutus.html, it will go to the subpages folder and then the aboutus.html file. You can also use ... to indicate going up a path in your folder structure. So say you're on subpages /aboutus.html and you want to go back to just washu.edu / home.html or whatever it is, you can use ... which will go up one directory. You can even chain multi // or whatever to go up multiple ones. Does that make sense? It's kind of, once you kind of use it, you'll figure it out. But ... indicates going back up one level from where you're at. You'll use that in other programming stuff too, dealing with directories. It's a pretty common pattern. Okay, a few other things you can do with links. So we can use mail to links, which will open the user's email program with a new email to whatever email address we provide. So you do that in the href. So we've got href equals mail to, and then you use a colon, and then provide the email address. And then, whatever text that you want. Typically, when I use these, I don't use them super often, but if I do use them, typically in the actual text of the link, I'll put the email address itself. So I'll use like mail to Kraig Hufstedler or craighufstedler@gmail.com, and then here I'll put craig.hufstedler@gmail.com as well. And I do that so it's a little easier to copy the email for people that don't use whatever the default mail to link is. You probably run into this, like on a Mac, I don't use the Mac mail program, I use Gmail. So whenever I click on a mail to link, it opens up the, Mac mail app, and usually there's 100 emails open from other mail to links I've clicked, and I have to quit it. I'm like, nope, get out of here. And then I have to, usually you can like right click on it and click copy email address. It's kind of a pain to do that, so that's why I usually put the actual email address in here as well, so the user sees that and they can just copy that if they don't want to use the mail to link. Then they can just copy it directly. So it's not that useful. Usually, sometimes I'll even just put the email address and not even worry about linking it. You can also use the target attribute to force a link to open in a new window or tab. So again, we've got our href. You can have multiple attributes by just putting a space between them. So after our href, we've got the target and equals, and you do _blank. Not sure why they decided underscore blank. Sometimes you can use like underscore new. There's a few other options you can use in Target here, but underscore blank is the most common, and it will open a new tab typically. So that can be really nice if you want to, link them to an external page. You don't want the user leaving your page. You just want it to open a new tab. You can also use a pound sign at the end of an href to link to a specific ID element on a page. So this is what we called the location fragment, I think, earlier. So one thing, you can even leave off the URL itself and just do href pound sign about us, and it will jump to an element on the page that has the ID about us. So that can be kind of useful. We'll talk about IDs in a little bit. Or you can link to a specific part on a page. So google.com pound sign about us will link to that specific part of the page. So I use that a lot. I'll show you an example after class, but even like that GitHub, the wiki page that has all the instructions for class, like usually I think it'll even let you copy the link for each heading, like each heading on that page. So if you wanted to link someone, hey, read this part of that page, you could link them to github.com/whatever the page is, pound sign, first step or something like that, and it'll jump to whatever that ID is on the page. So that can be kind of useful for linking to specific parts of a web page or jumping around to different parts. Some pages, they'll have like a menu, but when you click those links, it'll just jump you down to that part of the page. So you can use those types of links for that. Okay, questions about links. We're moving really quick. Again, I'll provide the slides. If you're just totally lost, that HTML and CSS book is really useful. You can also just Google these types of elements and get all kinds of examples. So there's don't be too concerned if you're just totally lost. Just review it, kind of get familiar with the elements. Once you kind of understand how HTML works, elements are pretty interchangeable. You can learn elements. I have to look them up all the time. Like, I can't remember exactly how to do this form element. I'll go look it up. So you don't have to memorize every single type of element. You kind of just need to be familiar with how HTML works, be familiar with what types of elements there are, and then you'll know when you need to use them. Okay, so image is used to include images on your page. So it's an empty element. There's no content inside an image, no text at least. So it's self-closing. So I'll show you an example here in a second. You use the source attribute to give the URL to the image that you want to display. So it can be relative or it can be absolute. So you may have the image included with your files. So it can just be relative. Or it may be absolute. You can link to an image from another website or from another domain, and it will load it that way. There's another required attribute, which is alt, which provides a text description of the image. So it's used primarily for screen readers. So again, if you've got images on your page, someone has a visual impairment, they can't see those images. Their screen readers reading the screen aloud to them. Screen readers aren't smart enough yet to be able to identify an image. So you need to provide some sort of text describing the image so that it'll read it to the screen reader. It will also display if the image doesn't load for some reason. So if the image is non-existent or you're loading from another website and it's temporarily down, it'll, instead of displaying the image, it'll just display your alt text. So that can be kind of useful too, especially if it's something important. You can leave the alt attribute empty if it's purely decorative and it has no meaning. So if you're totally sure that there's no meaning associated with this image, a screen reader doesn't need to be read aloud the description of the image. If it's just like a fancy you're using it to separate sections of your page or something purely decorative, you can leave the alt tag blank, but you still have to include it. So you still have to include alt equals and then your quotes, but just with no content inside. So again, that's really important because if you're missing the alt tag, the screen reader doesn't know whether it's important or not. The user, they hear that there's an image there, but they don't really have any information about it. But if you provide an empty alt tag, then the screen reader knows, okay, there's an image here, but it's not important, content-wise. I can, skip over it because you've provided that empty alt tag. If you leave off the alt tag, you're technically not within spec as well for HTML. It's required to have that attribute. It can be empty in some cases. You can also optionally provide a title, which will provide a tooltip on mouse over. So if you hover your mouse over the image, it'll pop up a little tooltip. You might use that sometimes for a description or a title or something like that. You can also use figure and fig caption, which are HTML5 semantic elements that can wrap an image and its caption. So often when you have an image, you might have some sort of caption that goes along with the image. So you can use figure to wrap the entire thing, have your image, and then fig caption will provide the caption. That way you can move the entire figure around, you know, if you're moving it in CSS or something like that, and it'll move the image along with its caption. Here's an example of an image. So first we've got just an image. Again, it's self-closing, so it doesn't have any text. It doesn't have an opening and a closing. It's just one tag. Our source here is a relative URL. So really common to have a subfolder to contain all of your images. So we're selecting the image from images/bird.jpg. Then we have an alt tag. This is pretty non-descriptive. It just says bird picture. You should really be as descriptive in your alt tag as you need to be. If this is just a random bird picture that isn't really important to my page, then yeah, you can just label it bird picture. But say you have a page describing different types of birds, you probably should include some more information and say this is a wren or whatever. So again, be as descriptive in your alt tag as you need to be to make sure that screen readers get as much information so that they're not missing out on anything by not being able to see the image. Then we've got our title here, which is top. Here's how you use fig caption. So we've got our figure, which is the entire element. It's got an image inside of it. Here's one way you may use a break tag. Technically, you don't need to. You can just make this display block, which we'll talk about later. But if we wanted to break these out onto new lines for our caption, a break tag here might be appropriate. So then we've got our fig caption inside of the figure, which provides the caption along with the image. So again, this is a really good way to do it. I really recommend it if you have some sort of caption that just goes with that image, because then you can style your figure all together or move it around all together, and you don't have to worry about moving them together, but independently. Okay, questions on images. A few other quick details. You can use height and width attributes, which will constrain the size of the image in pixels. So one thing to really keep in mind, this can also be done with CSS. So once we dig into CSS, we probably won't use height and width attributes. We'll do it in our CSS. But images typically take a lot longer to load than the rest of our page, right? So, an image may be a megabyte or 2 megabytes or whatever. So that takes a little while for the browser to download, whereas our HTML loads relatively quickly. So when the HTML loads, it'll leave empty spaces for those images. And if you don't provide the height and the width, either through our HTML attributes or via the CSS, it won't leave any empty space. So you've probably noticed this if you're browsing a page and all of a sudden it jumps, like stuff moves around. It's because the images is loaded all of a sudden, and when the image loads, it now has to make space for it, so it pushes the content down. So by providing a height and width attribute or doing it via CSS, we leave empty space while that image loads. So the browser knows, okay, this image is this size, so it'll leave a blank space there while the image loads. So that's kind of nice to do. It'll prevent that page jump. Again, you can also do that in CSS. Also, a big thing to think about, to help your page load faster, you should make sure, one, to resize the image to the proper size. So if you've got an image that's, 1,000 pixels by 1,000 pixels, but you're only displaying it as 200 pixels by 200 pixels on your page, and you're using height and width to resize it to 200 by 200, keep in mind that your browser still has to load that full-size image and then make it smaller. So it's going to take a lot longer than it needs to. So really the best thing to do is to actually resize the image to 200 pixels by 200 pixels and then include it. And one, you don't have to resize it now because it is the size it needs to be. And two, it's going to load a lot quicker than the 1,000 by 1,000 would. So a good thing to keep in mind. I've helped so many websites load faster just by doing that, especially if they're like photography websites. And I've seen guys upload not the raw image, but like they'll have a really nice, high megapixel camera, and they'll take all these pictures and they'll load them on their site, and they're all like 15 megs because they're like 4,000 pixels by 4,000. They're like giant images, just straight how it comes from the camera. It's like you don't need to do that. It's not displaying, that big. You can include a link to the full one if you want people to be able to download full resolution, but if you're making it smaller, there's no reason to have the image be much bigger than what you're displaying. Real quick primer on image formats as well. So there's kind of three main image formats we'll use on the web. PNG is a really good one. It supports transparency. It has a really strong algorithm for compression, so usually they look really good. It will be a little bit larger file sizes typically. All of these are compression algorithms, so they're different ways to take a large image and compress it somehow and combine information and make it a smaller file size while still having it look good. So PNG typically will look the best, but also have the largest file sizes. JPEG does not support transparency, so you can't have transparent backgrounds or stuff like that. It's really good for photographs and images with lots of different colors. So a photograph, every pixel is a different color typically. So JPEG's really good with that. It's also really good for the smallest file sizes. So JPEG, you can even, if you're exporting something as a JPEG, there's usually a slider and you can determine what percentage you want it to compress to. So that's really nice as well. So you can get really small file sizes with JPEG. Again, you're losing detail, but often that's a trade-off that we're willing to make to some degree to make our page load faster. GIF or GIF, if you prefer, supports animation, so you can have multiple frames and it'll animate through it. It has some limited transparency. You can have straight lines that are transparent. It's kind of a weird limitation. GIF is really good for illustrations or images with very few colors. So it'll compress really well. We use GIF a lot for like logos, things that are really simple, use straight lines, 1 or 2 or 3 colors. Think of like vector images, typically will translate best to GIF versus JPEG. And JPEG can be either JPEG or JPG. They're the same things. There's also, a couple of others, but these are the main ones that we'll see used on the web, just because they're the most compressed typically. So again, PNG really good for when you really care about quality or you need transparency. JPEG is really good for photos and pictures that you want to really compress. GIF is really good for simple illustrations, logos, things like that. Also, I think I mentioned here, if you don't have like Photoshop or something like that to be able to change these, Pixlr is a good tool. It's just an online Photoshop essentially that's free. So it's like pixlr.com, I think. It lets you edit images and then export them in different formats as well. So you can choose. You can even compare which format gets the smallest and looks best. So that's a good option if you need something to do that with. Okay, questions about where we're at so far? Maybe halfway through or so we're getting there. We've learned a lot of HTML. Okay, let's talk about tables. Tables allow us to create a grid of cells, so think about like Excel or something like that, to display data or information. There are some things tables should not be used for, such as creating a page layout, like a sidebar or something like that. Doing your site navigation or menus as a table is a really bad idea. This was really common probably like 5-10 years ago, before CSS was as popular or as well featured. Even when I learned web development in high school, I took a web development class, and the way we learned to do our page layout was using tables. Like, okay, create a table, make this cell this big, and that's your sidebar. Make this big, and that's your header. That's just the way that it was done. It's different now. We don't have to use tables for that. We should use tables only for displaying data, tabular data that should be in a table format. So if you're taking a science class and you've made tables of data, that's the kind of stuff you should use HTML tables for. So anything that needs to be actually displayed as a table. If you're doing layout with your table, really bad. Okay, so we use a table element to create the table. So that kind of wraps everything. We use TR, which stands for table row, to create each row. TH can be used to create a heading. So TH within the current row creates a cell that can be either a row or a column heading. Typically it's displayed as bold, but there's other ways we can do it as well. Usually it's centered by default as well. Then TD creates an actual cell within the row. TH creates a cell too, but it's just a heading cell. So you can have multiple TD elements to create columns. So if you have like a TR and there's two TDs, it's going to have two columns. You can use call span attribute if you want a cell to span multiple columns. So say you've got a 3-column table and you want your first cell to span 2 of those 3 columns. You can do call span equals 2 and it will span those 2 columns. You can also do row span to do the same thing amongst multiple rows. I'm going to try and move kind of quickly through this. If you want to read more on tables, do some Googling. There's all kinds of options you can do. One thing that's nice to do with longer tables is to create a header and a body and a footer. So inside your table, you can use T-head to create header rows and like T-body to create body rows. So one use that we'll use for this is maybe if you want your table to scroll, like say you've got a really big table and you don't want your page to be a mile long with that huge table. You want your table to be only 400 pixels tall, but it's got way more data. You can have the body scroll, and the header will always show, and you can even always show the footer, but the body itself you can scroll within that data. So that's why we might break it out into the T-head and the T-body and the T-foot. So again, by default, nothing's different, but you could use JavaScript or something like that to do the scrolling. Or even sorting, you only want to sort the body rows, but not the header or the footer. That's why you would kind of break that out into those different elements. So here's an example. So we've got our table, again, that wraps everything. Then we've got our T-head, which provides the header. And we've got a TR, which creates the row, and then 2 TDs. So here's our header. Our T-head is this row. And then we've created the row. Your header could have multiple rows in it if you wanted. But ours just has one. And then each TD creates a column. Then we've got our T-body, again, which has multiple rows. Each of those has the same 2 columns with those 2 TDs. That's it on tables. Any questions? Okay, again, if you have data you need to display, do some Googling, look up examples, figure out on your own exactly how you should use the table elements to make that table. There's a ton of other options you can do. Okay, forms. Forms are used for user input, so anytime the user needs to type anything, put any information in, login form, registration, and all those kinds of things are used with forms. How are we doing? Do we go to 10 or 10:30? I can't remember. 10. Okay, we'll wrap up here in a minute then. Let me see where we're at. Let's see how far we got. I think we're getting pretty close. Forms. So we're on 49 out of 85. So we'll probably just pause there and we'll finish the rest on Thursday. I'll show you just a quick example of like the white space issue and things like that. One really nice tool that we'll use in class some more is CodePen. CodePen.io. It lets you write your HTML and it will show you the rendered result. I don't need to log in. I'll just do. Also lets you like save them. Also lets you write CSS and JavaScript as well, and just shows you the result right there next to your code. So it's really, really nice. So let's change this to this layout. And let's do some HTML. So again, I'll show you headings. So we've got like a H1, and we'll do first heading. Oops. And then we'll do a H2. And then H3. just to kind of show, by default, again, each, the second and the third starts to get a little bit smaller, but by default they're bold. But again, like now we could have like another H1. Oops. But we wouldn't want to like jump straight to an H3 here. Again, it'll work, if we put like, let's do, if we jump straight from an H1 to an H3, there's nothing wrong about it. I mean, the browser will display it. It's like, okay, fine, I'll show you. But if we jump from an H1 to an H3, that's just not a really good structural practice. We want to keep our headings. It really should be an H2 here. And then we can style it however we want. So again, don't choose your heading level based on what you want the size to be. Paragraphs, if we just, start typing words, and we've got a sentence, let's just copy this and paste it lots of times. So we've got all this text, and we're like, okay, we need a new paragraph, create a new line, start writing some more. You'll notice our browser doesn't care that we added that line up here. We even could, add all kinds of lines up here. Our browser still doesn't really care. It's going to collapse it all. It doesn't really matter. So the way that we fix that, instead of creating all this empty space, is by using our paragraph tags. So if we do a P here, and then we close it here, then we do another paragraph here, and close it there. Now there's a line break in there in between our paragraphs, because paragraphs should have space in between them. And again, we can add however much space we want. Doesn't really matter. You notice the same thing in between words. If we add a bunch of space here, doesn't really matter. It doesn't change the way that it's displayed at all. So, just to show an example of like strong, we can do that within our paragraph here to indicate that, this word should be strong. It's going to be bold by default. Again, this is where you get in trouble if you forget the, oh, that was weird. It didn't really want, if you forget a closing tag, it's going to have the rest be strong as well. Oh, strong. It's not going to work. So that's where your closing tags are really important, to make sure you get your closing tags. Otherwise, it's going to have the rest of your content be inside that tag, technically. Anything else show an example of? We'll probably just leave it at that for now. I'll show you some more examples on Thursday once we finish all of the HTML slides. Okay, thanks, guys. We'll see you on Thursday. Oh, new assignment. It's on Canvas. Check it out. You've learned most of the elements you need to at this point to work on it. You've got a week creating a personal bio, so kind of your resume or your biography, or you can do it on someone famous or celebrity or something. It doesn't have to be about you. Also, if you took the 100 level class, send me a message on Slack or something. We're going to change it a little bit for you as well. So that's all.
Is the HTML CSS work on the syllabus?
Yeah. Yep. Yep. What's that?
For the first Hello World, I submitted my code here a while ago, like 8 days ago, and then when I went to the I don't really understand why exactly, but it doesn't actually show anything.
Oh, that's weird.
So
let's see, go back real quick.
Okay.
Go back again.
Oh, here.
No, like just hit back and go back one more. See your actual code. So
Oh no.
index.html. So click on the index.html. Yeah, so you've got the actual data there. Huh. That's kind of strange. Shoot me an email or send me a message on Slack or something.
Okay, I think I saw it. Yeah.
Quick, could I do the bio thing on a fictional character from a game I played?
Yeah, whatever you want.
Yeah,
Alright,
like
thank you. That's one to make.
Oh, okay.
So what?
Yeah, probably. I don't know how many are on the wait list currently.
Because the other section doesn't have like
Is this
wait
the
lists, still have space, but I just
Oh,
have
really?
another class.
Okay. Shoot me an email and I'll get back to you. But probably, as long as there aren't too many.
And will I be able to make up the missing assignments?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Like, yeah.
What's the incentive? Like
Mhm.
for
So you're, is that scheduled every class?
No, I'll let you know when they are. The first one's going to be, I think, next Thursday.
I don't know. You would just assume like restaurants would just.
Like the slide.
Because okay, what
Slide,
happens
I'll
if
send
you
a study
are
guide
in
as well.
line and
I'll put that out for you.
like is there like a 5 minute?
Yep, no problem.
I switched in the class last night, so I just have to make up the Hello World stuff.
Yep, yep. It's super simple. It's just basically getting your software set up.
Alright, I'll slide if I have any questions.
Cool. Sounds good. How's it going? How's it going, Chris?
It's good.
Good.
Slow.
Yeah.
You what?
Slow day.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
I hear you.
Okay. Yeah, because like when we went there and they were like, oh, it's 30 minutes to wait. So what I didn't realize is Yelp, they have a new program that helps small businesses like this.
Oh, yeah. Go like just home.
So they just like entered my name into the Yelp system and then like I get a
And
text.
then scroll
Yeah,
down.
and then I can open up the Yelp app and see
What is it?
like how many
Let me
people are.
refresh the
But it
page.
seems like
Make
the
sure.
no wait app
Should have been.
is a similar thing, but we have to show up physically.
Oh, is this the... I think I know what I did. Let me fix that. Are you in the second section?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, I think I added
Yeah.
to the first
You
section.
can check
Hold
that
on a
out.
second.
So
I'll
I
add it real
realized-
quick and you should get it.
Yeah, we just like
Yep.
we went geocaching. So. And it's there. Yeah. I'll check it out. Thanks for the advice.
Mm-hmm. Oh, really? Okay. Okay. I will ask Monet to fix that. Hey, how's it going?
Thanks, David. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
I joined this class a little bit later
Okay.
than everyone else, but
Sure.
I did get the first assignment done.
Cool.
But I was wondering, it says there's quizzes being
Mhm.
administered in this class. It's like, I'm guessing there's no calendar for exactly why the quizzes are.
Yeah, we kind of just do it as we go. I think the first one's gonna be next Thursday,
Okay.
so
I
I'll
was
probably
just wondering
announce
if I
that.
missed anything.
Yep, not yet.
Thank you very much.
Cool.
I also one more thing. I'm very sorry for being unprofessional, but I have an advisor meeting with Professor Citron at 10:30. I'll try to
Sure.
not make as much disturbances as possible. But
Totally fine.
registration's closed tomorrow, so I'm really sorry.
Yeah.
for this.
No problem. Doesn't bother me. Good. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Trying to think. Oh, the lecture slides have been posted. I've helped you forgive me. I may forget the section. There are 2 different sections in Canvas. I uploaded the first one, but not the second one. So it's up there now. If I ever forget anything, just shoot me a message on Slack, and I will get to it. We're going to learn most of HTML today. We're going to go pretty quickly. We'll push, I've learned in the first lecture, we'll kind of have to finish on Thursday. But, our goal here is to kind of give you a good introduction to HTML, kind of do a, really fast overview of what kinds of features HTML has, what kinds of tags there are. We're not going to be able to cover all of them in depth. We're not going to be able to show examples of all of them. It's kind of going to be up to you to, do your own research, look up things, figure out, the details of different HTML tags as you need to use them. So, again, we're going to be able to cover all of HTML pretty much between today and Thursday. So, we're going to kind of fly through. So, let me know if you have any questions as we go. And, again, the lecture slides you'll have available to you. They're relatively detailed. Again, you can find all this stuff on the internet as well. So if you need help with anything, if you have any questions about specific tags, how you use them, just do Google, and you will find that. Okay, so we talked last week about HTTP, kind of how the website communication works, how the internet works in general. Now we're going to talk about how we actually create web pages. So we create web pages using 3 different technologies. The first is HTML, or Hypertext Markup Language. This provides the structure and the content of our web page. So the word markup there is kind of important. So, think of we have our content, and the HTML is how we mark up that content. It's how we add structure to it, add, the content to it. So I don't know what that beeping is. It happened once or twice last semester, or last section too. Hopefully it does not continue. That's going to distract me. So our HTML is kind of how we add structure and meaning to our content. So think of like a newspaper. A newspaper has different sections. Each article has like a title and a byline and a date, and it has paragraphs and images and maybe a footer. If you just had all of that as raw text without any, information around it, you wouldn't really know what section is what goes where. So our HTML is kind of how we say, okay, this is a header, this is a paragraph, this is a link, so on and so forth. CSS, or cascading style sheets, is how we provide the styling. So we'll dig into CSS quite a bit as we go along in the class. JavaScript is a scripting language that provides functionality and interactivity. So we'll talk more about that kind of the second half of the semester. So anything you click on, anything you move around, any sort of data processing, any sort of, dealing with APIs and fetching data back and forth, those kinds of dynamic features are all handled via JavaScript. So your web browser downloads the HTML from the server. So, when you make a web request and that response comes back, it includes all of your HTML. And then the HTML includes the CSS and the JavaScript. So usually via links to external resources that the browser then will go and download. But the HTML is the complete web page, and it has links to the CSS and the JavaScript inside of it. Okay, dynamic versus static sites. So mostly in this class, we'll be dealing with static sites. So these are just HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files. They don't really change. They're static on the server. Again, we refer to these as the front end or client side. Dynamic sites is where there's some sort of programming language on the server that will generate the HTML for a given request. Static sites, we're just accessing a file and downloading that file, and that's our page. Whereas a dynamic site, you make a request to the server for, in my case, for my job, zoomride.com/washu or whatever. The server then processes that request. There's some sort of programming language that says, okay, what do I do with this request? Maybe look up some data, do all kinds of stuff, and then it generates the HTML dynamically. So it actually determines what the HTML should look like, usually uses templates and, is rendering things on the server, and builds the HTML and then returns it. So like when you go to, if you go to washu.edu, there's not a HTML file somewhere that serves, washu.edu. It's some sort of dynamically generated because there's content management, all kinds of stuff. So, it's not just an HTML file, you're accessing a dynamic site. So again, anything with a login or like e-commerce or discussion forums or content management, that's all going to be dynamic. So to create dynamic sites, you kind of need to know, the static side of things. You need to know the front end, but you kind of combine it with the back end at that point. It's getting a little bit murkier now, and we'll deal with this later in the class when we deal with what we call front-end rendering or client-side rendering like React, where we're actually fetching data and the JavaScript is adjusting our page. Kind of starts to blur the lines a little bit between static and dynamic. But for the sake of this class, we're accessing files on a server. We're not accessing, server-side rendered HTML. So if you're dealing with PHP or ASP.NET or Java, that's all dynamically generated. One thing we need to talk about is WYSIWYG site builders. So WYSIWYG stands for what you see is what you get. It gives you kind of a drag and drop interface where you can kind of type and draw and create the website how you want it to look. So there's different ways to do it. There's software like a Dreamweaver. There's some other software and kind of that's probably a little more old school. Or stuff on the web, Wix.com, Squarespace, those kinds of tools. They provide really powerful platform where you can create a website purely through a click, drag and drop type interface. So there's a lot of pros to this. It's easy and anyone can do it, right? You don't have to have any technical knowledge. You don't have to take computer science courses at WashU to be able to create a Wix.com website. My mom could probably make one if she really wanted to. I will recommend Wix or Squarespace to people that ask me, hey, I want to make a website for my band. I don't have any money to pay someone. I don't want to learn HTML. How do I make a website? Well, just go to Wix.com and it's real easy. You can do it. So they'll do that. There also are plugins for dynamic features. I have a buddy who built a full e-commerce website on Wix or Squarespace, one of the two. He set it up. It took credit card payments. Real simple to set up. You can create blogs, stuff like that. There are lots of cons. It's pretty limited. They've created kind of a walled garden, kind of a sandboxed, solution for you. And within the confines of what they provide for you, you can do all kinds of stuff, but you're still limited by what they provide. You can't, go too out of the box. It also doesn't generate very clean code. Again, if you use Wix or Squarespace for your assignments in this class, the TAs and myself are going to be able to tell very quickly because it's really obvious because the HTML is really crazy, the CSS is crazy, because again, you're dragging and dropping stuff, so it's, dealing with all kinds of, it has to do all kinds of crazy CSS to make all that happen. So typically it doesn't generate very clean code. Again, the biggest con is just how limited it is. There's only so much you can do. Here's kind of what Wix looks like. Again, if you want to change this text, you can just click on it and change it, and you'll see it reflected as you change it. Pretty powerful. Dreamweaver, at least, Dreamweaver is kind of a nice tool. It will show you your HTML. It shows you your DOM over here. Shows all your files. It gives you, some more developer-oriented tools. I know developers that will use stuff like Dreamweaver. It gives you a nice preview of what's going on. It can be kind of useful. There's also content management systems that are really popular. So again, software that runs on the web server, it gives you a system to manage your content that's tailored to managing content. So something like WordPress, something like that, you can, managing a blog, you can see the list of your blog posts, you can click on one, you can edit your title, you can, edit your content, highlight stuff and click bold. Really simple, really focused on your content. You can usually add a theme, and then it generates the HTML for you. So you're not writing HTML typically. It builds the HTML for you. So examples of WordPress, Drupal, etc. Again, lots of pros. Really easy to manage content. Again, really good for just dealing with content. I've done a lot of professional work on WordPress and Drupal. They're really nice for people that want to blog, but they don't want to build a website. I can build a website using WordPress, and then all they have to do is log into WordPress, and they can manage the content. Once I'm done building the site, I don't really have to touch it again, and they can write their blog posts and publish stuff and delete stuff and edit stuff, and I never have to worry about it again. That's kind of a nice setup for people that want a website. They want to be able to manage the content, but they don't have the technical skills to actually, build the website itself. Again, and really a lot easier to edit your blog posts, in WordPress than it is in your HTML, right? It'd be kind of a pain to pull up an HTML file and write HTML. So they're really good at managing content. You can deal with themes. You can even buy some really high quality themes that are pretty plug and play. Make it look however you want. You can add plugins, again, for functionality. E-commerce, I've done some e-commerce WordPress sites, stuff like that. It's pretty simple to do. Some cons, it can be difficult to set up, especially if you're hosting it yourself. You can run into all sorts of crazy stuff. WordPress is kind of a beast. It can be really hard to deal with. And again, it's limiting in features. There's only so much you can do with it. You've got restrictions. And if you try and break out of that, you can. With WordPress and Drupal, you can get under the hood and you can actually edit the PHP files, or you can build, your own plugins. You can edit the templates, but it gets real hairy because, again, it's a walled garden approach. They've created the system that should be able to work for everyone, but once you try and do something outside that, it starts to get really hard. So if you ever have a job that's like super customized WordPress, don't take it because it's really hard. So again, this is kind of what editing a blog post would look like in WordPress. You've got a title. You've got this visual editor. It looks like Microsoft Word, right? It's really easy, simple to use. You can add, change the format of what you want. Really nice for certain applications. So now that I've sold you on, these great tools for building websites really easy, why are we learning HTML, etc. The main reason is that all of these boil down to HTML and CSS and JavaScript, right? Like WordPress, in the end of the day, it's generating HTML and CSS and JavaScript. Wix.com is building HTML. It has to be using that behind the scenes to use, to work on the web. So understanding this underlying technology, one, helps us use these tools more effectively. If you know HTML and CSS, you can do a lot more customization within those walled gardens because you can, add your own CSS, etc. You can do a lot of customization with WordPress, etc. You can also understand their limitations a little better. I feel like I'm in a pretty good place to recommend. Like when someone talks to me about a web project, I can kind of understand, okay, yeah, you should really have this custom built by someone, or WordPress will work for you because your needs are limited enough that WordPress will do the job. Also, these tools are always changing. There's always new ones. Hopefully you guys can build the next Wix.com that works even better and has more flexibility, right? Like we kind of have to understand the underlying technology if we're going to be able to build new tools. Wix isn't going to be around forever. HTML probably will be, or it'll probably outlast it for sure. So that's why we're kind of digging in under the hood and kind of examining the underlying technology. Okay, so HTML. HTML is an evolving specification. It was invented in 1989 by a guy named Tim Berners-Lee at CERN. If you've ever heard of CERN, it's a particle accelerator facility in Switzerland. It's kind of interesting to me that, he's a scientist. It was created by scientists in the very, very early days of the internet when they didn't really have a good protocol for exchanging information over the internet. They had ways to connect to computers, through the internet, but they didn't really have a good way to exchange data. These scientists were always writing research papers. They were, doing research. They had data they needed to be able to share with one another. So HTML is kind of the agreed specification they came up with of how to exchange that data between different academics. The early internet was primarily, research institutions and universities because they needed to be able to share data. They needed to be able to talk to each other because they were always doing, research, and they needed to be able to talk. So it's really fascinating. That's kind of where it came from. The HTML specification is maintained by the World Wide Web Consortium, or the W3C, which is a bunch of different industry leaders. Again, it's important to understand HTML is a specification. It's not like a technology really on its own. The W3C publishes papers, really long, detailed papers that explain what HTML is and how it works and what all the tags are. The W3C doesn't actually, write any software for HTML. It's up to the browsers to implement the specification, right? So the browsers write the software that takes the HTML and per the spec, renders it how it should be. So it's always evolving. It started off, HTML1. HTML4 is kind of the most recent major version, which was finalized around 1999. That's still probably primary in use, but HTML5 has been finalized for 2 to 3 years now. They have a whole process there's proposals for new versions and what kinds of features and, what new elements they should add, what stuff they should remove, and then everyone kind of agrees, and then they finalize it, and then they publish it. So HTML5 has been ready. Browsers are still kind of catching up. Most HTML5 features are pretty safe to implement because all browsers support them at this point. Again, older IE still struggles a little bit with some HTML5 elements. But for the most part, we can write HTML5 now. It's like 99% adopted at this point. So pretty safe. I don't really know what's next. I haven't done much research on the next version of HTML or what kinds of stuff they're considering. But the W3C's website's there if you're interested in reading it. If you have, questions about any of these elements we talk about and you really want to understand the, nuts and bolts of how it's supposed to work, look up the specification. It's really interesting to read because they usually explain why, they made certain decisions and why things work the way they do. So again, because HTML has evolved, the doc type is the way that we indicate which version of HTML the browser should use. So we have to indicate the version of HTML that we're writing so that it knows how to render it. HTML5 has really simplified the doc type. All you have to do is doc type HTML. So this line right here should be the very first thing in your HTML file before any spaces, before any new lines. The very, very first thing is this doc type HTML. The HTML4 doc type looked like this. So if you ever see this at the beginning of an HTML page, it's using HTML4. Again, there was a lot more options. There were like loose and strict versions of the standard you could choose from. Yeah, question?
If you leave out the doc type, can the browser still infer?
Yeah, the browser usually will infer, and because most websites use HTML, right? So usually like, all right, this is probably HTML. But you're not going to be in spec. And sometimes they might throw an error or something like that. So yeah, usually it still works, but you really should always have the doc type there. Okay, any other questions? Okay, comments in HTML. If you've taken other computer science classes, you're probably familiar with comments. We use them the same way in HTML. You want to add them to your code. Usually want to explain portions of your code to your future self or other future developers to kind of, if you're looking back or adding something. You can use them to separate different sections or just make a note about why you did something that you did. I can't tell you how many times I've found comments in code I'm working on that's like, this is broken. It's like, okay, great. Why is it broken? How is it broken? It's not a very helpful comment. So try and be pretty descriptive when you need to add comments. One note is that comments can be seen by doing view source. So if you view source on the browser, you can see the HTML for that page, and you will see the comments in there, which can be interesting. You can see comments that developers left in their HTML. But it's really important not to include any sort of sensitive information in a comment. That's really, really bad practice. That's the first thing any hacker looks for when they're trying to break into a website or a server, is they check the comments and see if there's anything interesting in there. There's one of the recent, I want to say the Equifax hack that happened like 6 months ago or something, but it may have been something else. But one of them did have to do with comments. They were able to find like a default password or something in a comment, and were able to get in that way. So don't put anything sensitive in your comments. Again, you can comment out a line of code if you want to, adjust it or temporarily remove it. Most code editors, you'll use like / on a Mac or Control /. You can like highlight some code and hit that shortcut, and it will comment it out for you. Nice. Okay, so HTML, what is it? It's a language used to describe a structure of a web page. It's composed of elements that include an opening tag and a closing tag. And the closing tag is identified by a / at the beginning. So this whole thing is our HTML element. and it begins with an opening tag. That is the tag name. Again, we see these angle brackets that kind of wrap the tag name. The contents go in between the opening and closing tag. So this is our text. This is our data, our paragraph text, our heading, whatever it is. The contents go in between the tags, and then we have our closing tag that starts with a slash. So the whole thing's the element. The tags are the beginning and the end. So ultimately, our web pages are just made up of all of these elements, various types of elements. We've got like headings and paragraphs and lists. They often will contain a hierarchy of information. So when we're working with our HTML, we really want to think about how our data is structured, how our page is structured, what the hierarchy is. So what our headings are, what our subheadings are, lists, you can have nested lists. So again, the HTML tags go around our content. Again, it's like markup that's, you could think of just, pure text, and then you're adding, information to it to provide that structure. We can also nest elements within each other. So you can have a paragraph that has a link inside of it, or whatever, lists with nested lists. So, elements can be contained inside of each other. So some really important elements to talk about. First, we have our HTML element, or our HTML tag, which wraps the entire web page. So right after the doc type should come your HTML tag, and that wraps everything. Inside of the HTML tag, the first thing we have is our head, which provides some meta information about the page. The head tag doesn't actually get displayed on the page by the browser. It just kind of provides some additional information. And then the title tag goes inside the head tag, and it provides a title for our page, which will show up in the title bar. So up there at the top, in the top of the window where it's a CSE 204 Electro 2, that's the title tag. That's what how we indicate what goes there is through the title tag. Or it'll show up like on the tab or something like that if you're using tabs. So after the closing head tag, we have our body, which contains everything that actually exists in the browser window. So the body is what will actually show up visually. All these tags are required. So you have to have a head tag, even if all it has is a title. There's other tags that can go in our head, but the title is required. So all 4 of those tags are required tags. Again, sometimes you can leave it off and it still will work, but in order to meet the HTML specification, we really should include those. Yeah, question?
The title can be a blank string, right?
Yeah, it can be. You can't have a blank title.
Be there as an element.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. Yeah, if you really don't have a title or nothing makes sense, then yeah, it can be blank. So here's a quick example of a super basic HTML page. This is missing the doc type. I left that off for some reason, but we've got our HTML tag that wraps the entire thing, followed by the head tag, which has a title inside of it. Then our body that has the body of our page, what will actually show up in the window, and then we close our body. A quick note. Really useful to do this kind of indentation. So whenever you have tags that are inside of other tags, it's really, really good to indent them to indicate, what level they're at. I can't tell you how many times, in this class, students have come up and they've got some sort of problem with their HTML. So, okay, pull up your HTML, let's take a look, and everything's, along the left, and tags are mixed together, and it's like, okay, well, you're going to have to fix your indentation first so that we can see your code and kind of understand the structure of it. So really, really helps if you have a really, structured indentation. It doesn't really matter what the indentation is. You can have this all on one line if you want. It will work. It's just for us, it's just for you as a developer to reference. So typically anything, that is a sub tag or a sub element gets indented. Okay, element attributes. So attributes are a way to provide some additional information about the contents of an element. They appear only on the opening tag, and they have a name and a value. And the value is wrapped in quotes. We use the equal to indicate. Usually attributes have no practical effect. Some of them will. But typically they're used by our CSS or our JavaScript to interact with those elements, to identify them. We use like ID or class for that. But there are some ways that they'll modify the behavior or the appearance sometimes. So again, here's an example. We've got our tag name, then we've got attribute name, with a value. So again, this could be like ID or class. There's a lot of options here that we'll go over as we start looking at tags, and then we'll provide the value. Only on the opening tag, it's a way of providing some sort of additional information. So here's an example with some attributes. Again, also a nice thing to point out, if you're using actual code editor, it should provide some sort of coloring for you to kind of help you see these specific parts. So if you're just using like TextPad or something, it may not do this, but if you're using Atom or something like that, it usually will kind of help visually break out these different parts for you. So in this case, our attributes here are either yellow or orange or blue. So this is a style attribute. I'm showing this here as an example, but also kind of to show that you shouldn't really use style attributes. You may have for your first assignment in the extra credit if you found that. There's better ways to provide styling. We'll talk about CSS, which is a lot better than just doing style attributes. This is even going to be deprecated at some point if it's not already in HTML5. I can't remember off the top of my head, but we shouldn't really use the style attribute anymore. But if you wanted to, it's an example of an attribute you can use. There's also ID and class that we'll talk about later on. Images, we've got like a source that provides the URL to the image. Those are all attributes. You can also have multiple attributes. You can just separate them with a space. So we've got the equals and the quotes, then a space between multiple attributes. Okay, view source will allow you to see the HTML of any website in your browser. So it's different ways to pull that up in different browsers. Developer tools is even better. It gives you a really powerful interactive tool to kind of look at the different elements on your page. Lets you see the CSS. You can change the CSS and get live updates. You can even add the HTML as you go. You can like move stuff around. Really, really great. We didn't have this when I first started doing web development, like 10 years ago even, 15 years ago when I was learning it. It almost feels like cheating now. It's really, really nice. I use it all the time. I do most of my active development in the inspector even because it's so easy to add new CSS rules and modify stuff and see it live in real time. And then once I'm happy with how it looks, I'll copy the CSS rules over or whatever. But really, really great tool. If you're not using developer tools, you really should. It will help you solve lots of problems. Usually you can the way I get to it is right click on any element on your page and click inspect element. It'll open developer tools with that element highlighted for you. So super nice. Here's what it looks like. So again, you can see all of your HTML here. You can choose elements. It'll usually highlight that element on the page for you, which is really nice. Show you the dimensions. Over here, you can see the styles. So these are all the different styles associated with the element. You can click on these and change them. Super nice. It gets crazy. You can have it, add a hover state or something like that. Really, really nice. So developer tools, very powerful. Here's another example of HTML for some reason. I'm going to delete that slide. Okay, so first type of elements we'll talk about are text elements, which are kind of the most basic elements that we have. They provide just some structure to the text on our page. All of the elements inside of text elements should only be text. So, if you got a paragraph, you can have some other elements in there, but generally it's just text inside there. If you have a heading, it should only be text inside that element. The browsers by default provide some really minimal styling for text elements, but that'll be changed via CSS. So first we've got headings. So there's 6 levels of headings in HTML, so H1 through H6. The browser by default will make H1s the biggest and they get smaller as the heading level increases. So H1's largest, H6 is the smallest. You really should have your headings be structured. So you don't want to have an H2 unless it's a subheading from an H1, right? So that's a best practice. It's within the HTML spec. It's kind of how you're really supposed to, structure your page. Because you wouldn't have like a, Word document that has a subheading if there's not a, main heading somewhere under it. So really important that we think that way because, it's really common to just choose the heading level that represents the size that you want. So you say, oh, that H1's too big, I'll make it an H3 so it'll be smaller. We don't want to think that way with our HTML because we can change the size of things in our CSS. We want to think about the structure of our content, and so we shouldn't have subheadings that aren't under a main heading somewhere. That's why there's only 6 of them, because that's generally don't have more than 6 levels of subheadings. But you may make them really small or really big, or however you want to do it. So again, think about the structure, headings and subheadings. Make sure you really think about that. It makes a big difference in the structure of your page. Paragraphs are important. So P tags wrap individual paragraphs of text. They'll be separated by a line break and some margin will separate them. So that's kind of what we'll generally use for paragraphs. Bold and italic, you use the B tag or the I tag. I don't really recommend that you use these anymore, except for some really certain circumstances. We'll talk about that in a second. There's a better option. But they still exist. I think they're being deprecated as well in HTML5 at some point. Most browsers will still support them, but you really should move away from using B and I. You can do superscript or subscript. White space is important to talk about. So web browsers will collapse any white space in your HTML page. So if you add a line break in your HTML between some paragraphs or something, it will all get condensed and just be treated as one space. Same with like multiple spaces inside a sentence. If you say, oh, I want these sentences to be separated and hit spacebar a bunch of times, your browser doesn't care. It combines all of that and will be treated as one space. So there's a couple things we can do. One, just using the paragraph tag, because each paragraph gets a new line. That's kind of the best way to do it. We can also use BR or break tags to manually insert a new line. You should do this really sparingly, though. In fact, the goal should be to never use break tags, because it's kind of a manual way of doing it that typically indicates something about your structure or your CSS is wrong if you're having to use break tags. You should definitely never use multiple break tags to create a big space on your page. If you're doing that, you're doing something very, very wrong. Because we'll do that with CSS. With CSS, we can add padding, we can space things out, we can do whatever. So there's very few instances where you really have to use a break tag. And HR has a little bit more merit. It inserts a line break as well as a horizontal line. So we can use that to separate different sections or something like that. So again, it's a little bit more useful than a break tag. It's not just forcing a line break. It's actually providing some sort of structural element with a big horizontal line. Both of these tags are what are known as empty elements or self-closing tags. So it's got the tag name, but then you notice it just has a slash here at the end, and it doesn't have a closing tag along with it. This is because there's no text content that goes inside of the tag, right? It doesn't really need an opening and a closing tag because there's nothing to go in between the tags. It's just kind of an empty element. It stays on its own. There's some other examples of empty elements that we'll see as we go. Okay, so semantic elements. These are intended not to be structural necessarily, but they add some sort of meaning or some sort of context to our content. So they may have some default styling, but we'll customize it further with CSS. The primary purpose of elements is not style. They should only be used when they're enhancing the meaning of our content. So, for example, if you want, if you've got a heading and you want it to be bold, don't just use a strong tag, which we'll talk about, but you'd use an actual heading tag to indicate it's a heading. So again, we're not thinking about the style, we're thinking about the structure, and in the case of these semantic elements, the meaning of the content. So there's some examples we'll go over. Some of these. So strong and emphasis are the replacements for bold and italic. So if you think about it, strong and emphasis, those are more meaningful terms to describe our content than just bold or italic. Bold and italic reference the style, the way it should appear. We're moving away from having our HTML indicate the style. We want our HTML to purely be structure and meaning, and we'll deal with style in CSS. So strong typically is rendered as bold, but again, there's different ways that you can interpret strong. So you may style strong tags as a different color or a different size or some other way of indicating that they should be stronger rather than just bold. So by default, it's bold, same as the bold tag. But by using a more generic term and a more meaningful term, it's a better way to use it. Emphasis by default will be italics. Again, it can be used to kind of indicate what words emphasis should be placed on, where it kind of subtly changes the meaning of a sentence. So again, same as I. You can still use bold and italic if there purely is no meaning related to it, but typically you want to be adding meaning with these tags. Quotations are another type of semantic tag. So by default, these don't actually affect the style or the display at all. They're just ways of providing some more context around our content. So we can use block quotes for longer quotes that may take an entire paragraph or even multiple paragraphs. And you still may need to use the P tag inside of a block quote to indicate there are multiple paragraphs. We can also use Q for shorter quotes that sit in line with a paragraph. So you've got a paragraph and then you've got a quote inside that paragraph and it doesn't need to be broken out. You can just use the Q tag for that. You can also use the cite attribute to provide a URL with some context or some more information for that quote. So here's an example using block quote. It's got a cite attribute with the Wikipedia URL where we got it from, and then our quote itself is wrapped in a paragraph tag so that it gets a new line. We could have multiple paragraphs there if we wanted to. So that's how we use block quote. Questions so far? Okay. So these are a little bit less commonly used, but they do exist. So we can use ABBR for abbreviations. Typically, if you hover over the abbreviation, whatever you put in the title attribute will pop up as a tooltip to give you what the full term is. You can use cite to list a reference. So typically, it's rendered in italics. So I'll use cite every once in a while if I've got some paragraphs of text or something and I've got some sort of reference that I want to link to. Instead of just putting a plain link, you can use the cite to indicate that this link is a reference that goes along with the material or goes along with the paragraphs you just had. You can also use DFN if you're providing a definition of a term. So think of like a textbook and how keywords will be bold in the sentence where the definition is provided. You can use DFN to indicate that, hey, I'm giving a definition of a term in this sentence. So it's usually like within a paragraph or something, you'll have the DFN around the tag, around the term. Some browsers will italicize them. Like Firefox, I think, italicizes DFN tags, but Chrome and Safari don't. So again, that's something where the HTML specification probably doesn't indicate whether or not it's supposed to be italicized. So the browsers kind of chose what they should do based on their opinion, basically. But again, we can style it however we want in CSS. Here's a couple of examples. I really want to talk about address, which we can use to wrap some sort of address. It can be a physical address, a phone number, a web URL, or an email address. Again, it doesn't provide any style changes. It doesn't really do anything for the structure. It's just semantics saying, okay, this content is an address to something. So I'll use that quite a bit just to kind of as a way to indicate that this is an address. There's insert and delete, which we'll rarely use. Strike through, we might use sometimes. It just draws a line through the content, which can be used to show something's been deleted or something like that. Okay, questions so far? Been talking for a long time. My throat's gonna dry. Yeah.
When you create a site, when you click on it, does it take you to them, or do you need to create them?
Oh, that's a good question. I think you still have to add a link inside of it. Yeah, I'm not sure off the top of my head. I think if it's like a site in like a block quote, I think maybe if you like hover over it, it'll show you what the citation is, but it doesn't link it by default. But I think if you use this site, I think you still have to add an A inside of it. Because you might, it might be like a book or something. It doesn't have a link, but you can add a link tag in there as well. It's a good question. Same goes for address. It doesn't actually link anything. You'd have to use a link tag inside there. Thursday when I got home, I could like barely talk. I hadn't like talked much in the summer. And talked for 3 hours straight. Okay, lists. So several different types of lists we can do in HTML. We've got ordered lists where each item in the list begins with a number sequentially. So like recipe steps or table of contents we would use ordered list for. You know, so it's called ordered list, not like numbered list, and that's because we can change the type of numbering in CSS. So you could change it from numbers to Roman numerals or something like that. It's just that it's ordered. We also have unordered lists, so like bullet points, something where you know you don't need to indicate the number necessarily. Kind of like this, you know, bullet list here. We don't care that it's 1, 2, 3, and 4. It's just they're bullets. We also have definition lists, which are terms along with their definition, so it's a list of terms. And one note too, we can nest lists inside of each other. So you may have an ordered list where each item of the ordered list has an unordered list inside of it, or another ordered list inside of it. You know, have sub bullet points, stuff like that. So here's how we do ordered lists. We use the OL tag, which stands for ordered list. Inside it has list items, or LI, and then we close our ordered list once we're done with it. So you notice I don't have like 1 and 2 on these, but the browser by default will add the numbers for us. So it'll calculate which number it is, and it'll add that number. And again, you can change the format it uses, whether or not there's a period after it, that kind of stuff with CSS. Unordered lists look very similar, except instead of OL, we use UL for unordered lists. And instead of numbers, we get bullet points. Again, we can change the type of bullet points. By default, it's these round, solid ones, but you can have, squares or hollow circles. You can even add your own images if you want, your own custom type of bullet. In CSS, you can add an image that it'll use for those bullets. Definition lists are a little bit different. We use DL for definition list. DT wraps the term, and then the definition follows the DT using a DD to provide the dictionary definition. So you kind of have to have these like couplets, and you can have multiple of them. You can have them out of order if you want. I've seen some people do that, like they'll list several DTs and then they'll list several DDs. You can do that. I like to kind of keep them linked, but it just kind of depends. I think keeping them, next to each other is better for screen readers because, again, the screen reader is going to get here. It knows this is a definition list, and so it's going to read the term followed by the definition. So again, that's where we have to think about how a screen reader is going to, read this content. Definition lists are a really good example too of why we care about using the proper types of elements. So this is what this list looks like. We could just do this with, paragraph tags or something and, add some spacing, and this could each just be a paragraph. But when a screen reader reads it, it's just going to read HTML, Hypertext Markup Language, CSS, Cascading Style Sheets. It doesn't get any contextual information about that data. But by using a definition list, now it's going to read it, and it's going to tell the person listening to the content, okay, this is a definition list. The term HTML has the definition, Hypertext Markup Language. So it kind of gives them that contextual information about what's going on, helps it, to kind of make more sense. And they may do different things as well. Typically, the definition is indented a little bit by default by the browser as well. We can change that. You can adjust it in your CSS, but by default, that's what they'll do. Okay, links. So we use the A element to create links. The content in between the opening A tag and the closing A tag is the clickable part of the link. So whatever the user sees, they can click on. We use an href attribute to indicate the page the link should go to. They're by default style is blue and underlined. They'll turn purple once they've been clicked, but we can change all of that in CSS. One thing to talk about a little bit is absolute URLs and relative URLs. So an absolute URL contains the full web address. So it has the HTTP and the domain and the full page that we're going to. So typically we use that for like external links that are going to a different website. We'll use the full absolute URL. A relative URL is relative to the current page you're on and the current domain that you're on as well. So you'll see a link where it's just the href is aboutus.html. So say you're on, washu.edu/home.html, and you click on this link, it's going to take you to washu.edu/aboutus.html. So we'll use those relative links for links within the same website, just different pages on that same website. There's a couple of tricks we can do with relative URLs as well. If you just link to the file name, it's going to be a page within the same folder. But we can also traverse directories. So you could do you could add a subfolder. You had subpages/about-us. That'll go into a different folder. Or you can use .. to go up a level in your folder directory. So say you're in subpages/ something.html, you can go to link to .. /about-us, and it'll go from the subpages up a level in your folder directory to a different file. You can also chain multiple .. together. You can do .. / .. to go 2 levels up. There's also mail to links. So they'll open the user's email program and fill out an email to address with the email address you provide. So you use the href for that, and you do mail to : and then provide the email address. I typically try to be pretty careful when I use these because I don't use the default mail app on my Mac. Like the mail app, I use Gmail. So anytime I click these links, it opens up the mail app, which I don't really have configured, and there's usually a ton of emails open from other times I've clicked these links. So I find that really annoying because I have to quit the app, I have to go back to my browser, I have to copy it. So usually what I do is, if I use a mail to link, I'll at least put the email address in the actual text of the link as well, so the user can just highlight it and copy it if they want. Usually you can right click and click copy email or something like that. But typically, instead of just saying email Kraig, I'll actually just put the email address in there as well. So that's just me. I run into that a lot. I find it very annoying, so I try to be nice to other people and think about that. Again, sometimes you just don't even need to use the mail to, because not everyone uses it. You can also force something to open in a new tab. So you use the target attribute. So we've got our href, and then we've got our target equals, and you do _blank, which indicates to open in a new blank tab. There's a few other options you can put in there, but _blank is the main one that we'll use. You can also use a # at the end of an href to link to a specific ID element on the page. We'll talk about ID elements on Thursday, but you can, specify, indicate a certain part of your page has a certain ID. So you could say you could have just the # about us, and it'll jump to that part of the current page you're on. So that's really nice. We'll see that a lot. Different menus will just jump to different parts of the page. You can also do an absolute URL, google.com # about us, and it'll jump to google.com, and it'll jump to that part of the page. So that's kind of a useful way to link to a really specific location. I'll use that a lot, at work. We have documentation pages, and they'll have IDs, and if I'm telling somebody about something, it may be a long page, but if I only need them to read one paragraph, I'll send them a link with that ID to the paragraph to it. Some stuff like GitHub, I think, will even show you a little link icon on each heading, and you can copy it. Yeah, question?
What is the _blank?
That's to make it open in a new page or a new tab.
Are there other options?
There are some. You can even have named windows. So you could you could say target equals window 1, 2, 3. It's not used as much anymore, but it used to be where if you had you wanted to open a certain window and then open new links in that window as well, you can name it. But _blank's pretty much all we ever use. So, any other questions? Okay. Yeah.
What if you because you said Windows in your response, I was curious. That thing blank creates the page in a new tab. What if I want to do it in a new window?
Yeah, I think it's _new that forces a new window. The problem is a lot of browsers block that. Yeah, because pop-up. So it used to be even _blank, I think, would open a new window, but yeah, most browsers now don't let you open a new tab in a new window because of pop-ups. So they've locked that down. That's a good question though, and yeah, if you research it, there's a couple other options you can do there, but typically blank is what we'll use to do new tabs. Okay, so we can use image or IMG elements to include images. They're empty elements. There's no content or text inside of them, so they're self-closing. They have a little slash at the end rather than an opening and closing tag. They've got a source attribute to give the URL to the image. It can be relative or absolute, so it could be an image you've got within your files of your website, and you can link to it that way, or you can link to an image on a different website. There's also a required attribute of alt, which provides a description of the image. So it's used for a couple things. It's used for screen readers, so that's the most important use. So a screen reader, they're not smart enough yet to do AI on an image and then find a description of the image or something. So you have to provide some contextual information about what that image is, so that screen reader users can understand a little bit about what's going on there. So you want to be pretty descriptive in your alt tags. You don't want to just say this is an image. You want to say what it's an image of and why it's there. It also, I don't think I mentioned it here. Oh yeah, if the image is no longer accessible. So if the image doesn't load for some reason, if the file's been deleted or the page it's hosted on is down, it'll show the alt text instead of the image. So again, that can be useful as well, just to make sure that even if the image is gone, the users understand why that big space is there. I've seen that a lot for like, I don't know, like Twitter or something like that. If the profile image doesn't load, it'll still put the name there, so you can say, okay, that's who it is that's tweeting, even though you don't see the image. Stuff like that. There's also an optional attribute of title, which will provide a tooltip when you mouse over. So when you hover over an image, a little tooltip will pop up. So you can use title attribute to provide that. Also, you can use figure and fig caption, which are HTML5 elements that will wrap around an image and provide a caption as well. That's a really handy thing I like to do when there's some sort of caption that goes with the image, because then you can move the entire figure around, and it'll move the image along with its caption. So that's kind of nice. So here's an example of image. So first we've got just a plain image. We've got a relative URL to the images directory in our website. We provide some alt text. This isn't very descriptive. You should probably say it. You can be, use your judgment on how descriptive you need to be. If this is a bird picture that's just, for fun, or it's just, kind of I don't know, it's not important to the content, then yeah, you could just say bird picture in your alt text. But say this is a website about different types of birds, we might want to include that information then, because it's probably important. We'll probably have a section about wrens, and so we want to say this is a male wren or something like that in our description. So be as descriptive as you need to, depending on what your content is. Here's an example of using figure as well. So we've got the figure element, and inside of it is our image, and then our fig caption provides the caption. And there's an example of where you may need to use a BR. There's other ways to avoid it. You could set these to like display block or something in your CSS, but by default, images and fig captions are inline, so you'll have the image and then the caption will be next to it, but if you want the caption on a new line, you might use a break tag for that. Yeah, question?
I don't exactly understand the keyword alt. Is it just for when people are looking at your code and they want to know what this is referring to?
No, it's the screen readers will read it, because the screen reader can't read, can't see the image. So it'll be read aloud by the screen reader. It also will show up in place of your image if your image doesn't load. So if the image doesn't load, it'll just show the text. Yeah, question?
If your source is another link from another web page,
Mhm.
when you download the HTML once, does your servers save the image, or whenever someone wants to access your web page, do they download do they bring it up from that website each time?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It'll pull it from your external web page each time. Your server doesn't really deal with it. The browser may cache it. The browser might save a copy of it, but yeah, it's going to make a network request to that separate web page. So you kind of have to be careful if you're using external, like, so this, I'm linking to it on Wikipedia. Wikipedia is pretty safe because they're probably not going anywhere. They also provide a really generous license for using images, but also you want to consider the license of the image you're using. If you're pulling it from some website, it may be a copyrighted image that you don't have a right to show on your webpage, so you have to be really careful about that. Yeah, question?
Because Wikipedia is like people go and change the content, isn't it kind of sketchy to use?
It's true. That is something to keep in mind, for sure. Because, they may change the URL or they may replace the image with something else. So, that's a really good point. So if it disappears one day, you're not going to know until people start complaining that your website doesn't work because those images don't load anymore. So, typically, especially for anything important, you want to download the image, include it in with your file so it's a relative URL, not trust that external website. So, really good point to bring up. You can even see, show an example in the inspector. You can even see what all network requests are being made. So, if we go to Wikipedia, I think there should be some images. So even here, if you open up the inspector and go to network, these are likely, then you have to reload the page. But you can see these are all of the requests being made by the browser. So we see the wikipedia.png, and you can see the domain these are being pulled from. So these are all being pulled from Wikipedia, but the browser's having to go load those images separately. So if it's they're external images, you'll see that those are from a different domain.
Does that mean that they're pulling them from database website, or do they have the actual file?
Yeah, they have the actual file on the. It's still going to be a network request, but it's at least their same domain. So they have control over it, Whereas if it's an external domain, you don't have any control over it. Okay, so there's also a height and width attribute that we can use to set the size of the image in pixels. So this is really good to do. We can also do this with CSS, so we probably won't deal too much with the height and width attributes in our HTML. We'll do it in CSS. But images often take a lot longer to load than the rest of your web page. Your HTML downloads pretty quick. It's just, text. But, the images may be a couple megabytes. It may take a few seconds, to download them. So if you don't provide the height and width of your image, the browser won't leave any space for them. The browser doesn't know how big they are until it's done downloading them. So all of your content will just be squished with no extra space for those images. And then once those images load, then your browser jumps your page down and adds the space needed for those images. You may have noticed this, especially if you've ever been on a really slow connection. You'll load a page, you'll start reading it, and all of a sudden everything moves around, and it's because the images have loaded and it creates the space for them now. So if you provide the height and width, either as attributes or in your CSS, it will prevent that page jump because it actually saves the space for it while it loads. So it's really nice. It helps make sure your site looks good while it's loading your images. You should also make sure, especially if you're concerned about page speed, how fast your page loads, you really should resize your images to whatever size you're going to use. So say you have an image that's 1,000 pixels by 1,000 pixels, but you're only displaying it as 200 pixels by 200 pixels, you should resize it using a photo editor first, so that your browser doesn't have to download the full 1,000 pixels only to scrunch it and remove half of them anyway. So that's going to help your site load a lot faster. I love whenever, just as freelance, sometimes I'll have clients come and be like, hey, our site's really slow, can you help? And I'm always like, yes, I can help you. And the first thing I do is I go through all their images, I resize them to the size they're actually shown on. I usually compress them a little bit more. I can drop their page load time from 20 10, 15 seconds to usually 2 or 3 seconds just by getting the images the right size so they're not downloading unnecessarily large images. And then they're like, whoa, you're so brilliant. You made our site so much faster. I'm like, yes, you're welcome. All I did was resize your images in Photoshop. So you can become a hero if you know how to resize images. Pixlr is a good online editor if you don't have Photoshop. I think it's pixlr.com. It's basically Photoshop online. So you can resize images there as well. Another thing to talk about with images is image formats. So these are kind of the 3 main formats of images we'll use on the web. So PNG is really common. It supports transparency, which is its biggest plus. So you can have transparent parts of your image. Typically, it's going to be a little bit larger file sizes, a little bit higher quality as well. So PNG is good if you really care about what the image looks like. You want to make sure it looks as best as it can. PNG is kind of the best to use, but the trade-off is you're going to have a little bit larger file sizes. JPEG does not support transparency. It's best for like photographs or images with lots of different colors, and it can compress to smaller file sizes. So all of these are just different compression algorithms. They're different ways of compressing images, and running an algorithm across the image and combining pixels and making sure it still looks good, but also reduces the amount of data used. So they each have their strengths and weaknesses, right? GIF or GIF, if you prefer, has the benefit of supporting animation, so you can have multiple frames and create animations. It has really limited transparency. You can do some like straight lines that are transparent, but typically your options are limited there. GIF is really good for illustrations or images with very few colors. Just the algorithm that it uses to compress, it does really well with straight lines, with single colors. You can take like a logo or something like that that's a really simple, illustration, and a GIF can compress it really well just because the algorithm it uses is better at dealing with those types of images. Whereas JPEG is going to do a lot better, with a photograph. Where every pixel is different. So like JPEG will do like averaging. So it'll like look at a cluster of pixels and it'll say, okay, what's the average color here? And then it'll create a new image that has the average. So it might take a 2,000 pixel by 2,000 pixel image and reduce it. And it's kind of averaging out the colors. Whereas GIF does a lot. If you do that with like a logo that has like white and then a solid line that's red, it might find an average that's like pink, right? Because it's like white and red are next to each other. So JPEG might cause some pink areas, because it's kind of averaging the white and the red at some point. Whereas GIF does really well at like finding edges of shapes and stuff and then saying, okay, it's white up to here and then it's red. So GIF is going to be what you're going to want to use for logos and stuff that need to look really crisp, whereas JPEG is good for photos. Or PNG is good for everything as long as you're okay with it being larger file size. So if you really care about maintaining the quality, PNG is really good. Whereas JPEGs can get really small. Usually when you export a JPEG, you can even select the quality you want. So you can do like, by a percentage, you can say 80% quality, and it'll reduce the quality. So it'll do more averaging in order to save more space. So you can get images pretty small using JPEG. Okay, any questions about images before we move on to tables? We're on time. Okay, so HTML tables allow you to create a grid of cells, so think of like Excel or something like that, to display data or information. Tables should not be used for creating a page layout or like a sidebar or like navigation or like menus. When I learned HTML when I was in high school a long time ago, we did use tables for kind of doing the structure of our page. It's like, okay, create a cell here, make it this big, this is going to be your sidebar, that kind of thing. Because that's just how you did it back then. That was before CSS was quite as powerful. We had more limited options, so we used tables for everything. It's a really bad way to do it. Because if you think about, you want your HTML to be your structure, not your style, not your layout. Tables should be for tabular data, any data that makes sense to use with tables. And it's really hard to do layouts using tables as well. You'll have a bad time if you do it that way. It's way easier to do it the proper way. So again, what tables should be used for is displaying data. Anything that, you know, is actual data that can be formatted in a tabular format, use a table for that. How we do tables, we use a table element to create a table. TR is used for each row, stands for table row. TH will create a cell within a row that can be used for a heading. So I think by default they'll be bold and centered. So think of like the column heading or something like that. We'll use TH for that. Then TD will just create a normal cell within a row. A row can have multiple TD elements, which is how we create multiple columns. There's a couple of things we can do. The call span attribute will cause a cell to span multiple columns. So say you want a cell to span 2 columns, you can use call span equals 2, and it'll span those 2 columns. Also, we can do the same with row span and have a column or have a cell span multiple rows. Another thing to talk about, we have headings and footers. That you can use this as optional, but if your table makes sense, if you have a really clear header row or multiple rows that are all header information, or you have really clear footer rows, so maybe at the bottom of your table you have like a totals or something like that where you add up all of your rows. Maybe you want to use the T-foot to wrap the footer. So this is inside of your table element. You'd have T-head for your header or T-body for the body, T-foot for the footer. It's not set any differently by default. It doesn't really do anything, but it can allow for some interaction, such as scrolling. Like if you have a really long table, but you don't want it to take up, you know, a full page of your, you know, website, you could say, okay, make the body 400 pixels tall and make it scroll, so the content inside would scroll, so it can have more content than may fit there, but you can scroll. That's stuff you would do with CSS or JavaScript. Or you might sort. You might want to sort like your body column or your body rows, but not your footer row, because the footer is the sum. It's always going to stay the same. You can use JavaScript to do some sorting on the rest. So again, they're optional, but they're kind of nice to have. So here's an example of creating a table. We've got our table element that wraps the whole thing. Here we've got our T-head, which again, you know, we could remove and it doesn't really change anything. We've got our TR, which creates a row, and then 2 TDs. So we're going to have 1 row, and then each TD creates its own column. So, you know, one thing to point out, we've then got our body and other rows here. If this row had 3 TDs, we'd have an extra column over here, and this third row would have data in it, but the rest wouldn't, because they don't have TDs there. So we'd have 3 columns here, but just 2 columns for these other 2 rows. So, and you can kind of change how that works. Sometimes it'll show empty cells up here. Sometimes it won't show up to empty cells. There's a setting that you can use to change that in CSS, but that's generally how tables work. Any questions about tables? Again, if you need to use a table for something, I really recommend, you know, looking up, you know, tables, you know, finding the reference, because again, I haven't even covered all the options. There's additional things we can do with tables, you know, so I still, whenever I deal with tables, I have to look up, you know, the reference on the Mozilla Developer Network, MDN, or even pull up the specification. It's a little hard to read usually, but you know, find some reference that kind of goes through the options and kind of use that as a guide as you're making your table. Okay, before we finish up real quick, I want to show a couple of examples just to kind of illustrate a few things. So let me actually log in because I think I've got it saved. And so a really nice tool, by the way, is CodePen, codepen.io. It lets you write HTML and CSS and JavaScript, and it renders it for you, kind of in a different, you know, pane. So it's really nice for just kind of messing around with stuff. You don't have to worry about files or anything. We'll use this for a couple of labs later on in class. Google, come on. These are the worst. I think I got all the crosswalks. That's a crosswalk. That's probably a crosswalk. What is it doing? Why does it think I'm a robot? Oh, these are dumb. It's making me read. Ah, this sucks. That wasn't a crosswalk. It does not believe me. I think these count, right? You don't think so? The very bottom?
At the bottom of the sign, yeah.
Yeah, okay, I'm gonna include it. Verify. Please work. Oh my gosh. You guys know what this is too, right? Like they're training their AI. That's all. Okay, there's a car. Okay, this one has a car. This is making me so mad. That's gotta be all. Oh no, there's cars. Why is it so ridiculous? Is that a car? I'm just gonna click. Yeah. Okay. Verify. Thank goodness. Okay. Where are my saved pins? CodePen also lets you save, pins too. So if you want to, play around with stuff, it's a good option. Where did I go to? My pins. Okay, let's go to there. Next. Let's look at HTML introduction. I'll post this on Canvas too if you guys want to mess around with it. Okay, so here we have some HTML. We've got our head here, and actually put a body tag, but there should be a body tag here as well. But so we've got our heading, we've got some text. One thing I wanted to show is like if you say, okay, I've got this paragraph, but I want some more space between this paragraph and this heading, and so you hit enter a couple times, create some space over here. Your browser doesn't care. The HTML, it doesn't matter. It's not going to actually create that empty space for you. So the way we'll do that is with CSS. So we'll talk about that, when we get into CSS. One way you could do it would be using break tags. If we added, a couple of break tags, that's going to create that space. But again, that's not the right approach. So if you ever, have multiple break tags, you will make me very upset and disappointed, and probably take points off just because. So don't use multiple break tags. It's a bad thing to do. You could even we could have this heading right up next to this paragraph if we wanted to. It doesn't matter, right? Because your HTML just reads, okay, paragraph. Oh, now heading, that gets a new line. So it puts a new line for your heading. Same goes for space within a paragraph. You could space out words. The browser doesn't care. It's not going to add that space for you. There's some other CSS ways we could do that if you really wanted to. So yeah, I think that's all I really wanted to show. I probably have a table demo. Yeah. I will look at some of these other HTML elements as well. So this one will show some of those elements we talked about. So here's an example of using ID. We'll talk more about ID later. Here we've got bold and italic. Here's how we would use that superscript or the subscript. Kind of makes it up above or below. Again, you might do that if you're writing some scientific stuff, but you might not otherwise. Here's what the block quote looks like with the site. So yeah, that's right here. Yeah, it's not really doing too much. It's not doing anything when we hover. So yeah, that's more of a behind the scenes type of thing than providing that citation. Here's abbreviation. So by default, this is Firefox. It kind of shows the abbreviation is kind of underlined here. So if we hover over it, it'll show whatever the title we gave it, in this case, Hypertext Markup Language. So that can be kind of nice. Here's the definition. So again, Firefox is italicizing it. Then we provide the citation as well. Here's showing the address. Again, it doesn't really do anything by default. Actually, it italicized the address. If we get rid of this, it's probably going to unitalicize. Scroll back down. By default, italicizes address tags. I think Chrome doesn't. So again, that's kind of where you need to know the differences a little bit. Here's what our lists look like. Here's how we would nest a list. So we've got a UL here with some list items, and then we've got an OL with some list items. So this OL is inside of this list item because we don't close this list item until after the OL. So that's how item 3 will have a sub list with additional steps. Show this table real fast. So here's kind of some examples how we'll do a table. So we've got like the 3. These are our THs for our headings. You notice here, you kind of have to mess around with it to get it to work how you want. Here I wanted a row heading and a column heading. So you notice, my full table here has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 columns in it. And we'll see where the 5th one comes from in a second. But for these 4, to kind of create an empty cell up here, I had to just do a TB that's blank. So then I can have my Monday, Wednesday, Friday, which show up in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th row or columns. Whereas, here in my 2nd row, I've got week 1 as a heading using TH. So week 1's the heading, and then 12, 14, and 15. So again, you may have to put some empty cells here and there to kind of get it to work how you want. And then like if we scroll down, we'll see this row right here has the 5 columns in it. It's got week 2, and then we've got 4 numbers, so that's where it added this extra cell. Even though the rest of these only have 4, because we have 5 columns here, it's added that extra one, and these are just blank. So that's kind of how column tables work. You just kind of have to mess around with it. Here's an example of using call span. So like if this is a schedule, geography here spans 2 columns. So you'll notice geography spans both the 9 and the 10. Same here with science, takes up 3. So that's kind of how that works. Here's an example of using like the T head and the T body. So we've got our T head, which contains 2 heading cells with student and grade. So let me scroll down any more. But then like maybe we use T foot for the average. So it's different data. Like the T body contains our data that's like student grade, like that's our data. The heading, is different. It's a label, and then our footer is different as well. It's a label and then an average. So that's where it kind of makes sense to break those up into different sections, so it's pretty clear which is a heading, which is the body of our data. Okay, I put the new assignment up on Slack. So the second assignment, it's creating, using all of these HTML tags we've learned so far to create a personal bio page, or it can be like a celebrity or someone, whatever you want, your dog or something. So there's requirements in the assignment of what tags you need to use. So you need to use a lot of these. So fill out whatever information makes sense to add. I think I said due next Thursday, next Tuesday, and we'll continue where we picked off or where we left off on Thursday. All right, thanks guys. Let me know if you have any questions.
So I spoke to you last week. I'm missing class with your child. I couldn't find your email online.
Oh,
yeah.
Oh, okay. It's on the syllabus. If you go...
Is the syllabus on Canvas?
Yeah, if you pull up Canvas, one of the first links is the syllabus. And it's got
okay. Cool. I mean, I don't know. It's... The first day I'm missing is 2... It's basically going to be just the next 4 weeks. One day each week.
Okay, gotcha.
Oh, no, because there's no class on Wednesday. So
Yeah.
It's gonna be 3 classes.
Okay, cool. Yeah, mainly just let me know if you miss a quiz or something like that. Just let me know ahead of time so we can schedule something.
Okay, I'll send you the dates. I'm gonna do this right now.
Yeah, sounds good.
Is this standard for CSS having it in the head, or should
Say
you
it
have
again?
it for having like the CSS?
Uh-huh.
Should it be in that like head, or should it be like in its own like separate CSS file?
Yeah, it should be in a separate file, really.
Okay.
We'll talk about that more when we get into CSS.
Okay.
We can include it in your actual HTML, but it's best to have it in a separate
Okay,
file.
that makes sense. And then,
Yep.
are we able to use Bootstrap at all?
Yeah, we'll don't use Bootstrap until we introduce it in class, just because I want you to kind of learn some more stuff.
Okay.
But then, yeah, we'll use it in class before too long. So.
Okay. Sounds
Yep.
Is this class traditionally offered just in fall, or is this done in every class?
I'm not sure yet. We taught it. Well, this is the first time we've taught this specific class. We
Right.
did.
It's 204.
Yeah.
104.
And I did 104 last spring. I'm not sure yet. They haven't asked me about the spring, next semester yet. So.
But it's usually at
I'm
least
not
in
sure.
every fall. Because I'm a
Yeah,
junior,
usually.
but I realized that shouldn't be, I literally don't need to take more than 4 credits right now.
Oh,
so
yeah,
I might
gotcha.
take this later.
Yeah.
And
I can't tell you for sure.
But like 80% chance to be offered next fall.
Either next fall or this spring. Either or. If we teach in the spring, I probably will take a break next fall.
Right.
Probably.
Okay, but at least there'll be another time in the next year.
Yeah,
and a
there'll
half.
be another time in the next year. So yeah, you're
Okay,
good.
Thank you.
Yep. Hi, what's up?
We both just added the class,
Oh, cool.
so we want to check about the first assignment.
Yep. Yeah, just get it taken care of. There's no late points or anything. It's just mostly to get the software set up to go through class. So if you have access to Canvas, yeah, you should be out of the class.
Okay, I don't think I've been added yet. I just added it this morning.
Okay, I think it takes like a day or something.
Okay.
So just once you get added to Canvas, there's instructions on there. So there's a link to instructions. It seems complicated, but it's pretty simple. You just have to do some different software stuff. If you have problems with it, contact us on Slack or see me after class. No rush, to get it done. So.
Great, thank
Yep.
you.
Thanks, guys.
Same here. I just
Yeah, what's up?
added the class yesterday, so it's
Okay, yeah.
big.
Just wait until you get added to Canvas, and then you will grab the first assignment.
And about you said that don't use too much breakline.
Mhm.
It means like don't have too much breaks DNR or
It's more that if you want to create that space, don't use break text to do it.
then use.
We'll use CSS. We haven't covered that yet,
Oh.
but we'll cover that in a week or so.
Okay, for now, if I want to do breakline,
Yeah, for now, if you want to.
thank you.
Cool. Yep.
I have a question about
Sure.
submitting exercises.
Uh-huh.
So do we just do the commit and push on each individual exercise in the package? That would be
Yep.
good. Because that's what I did for exercise 2, but I want to check candidates. It didn't upgrade my grade. So
Oh, I gotcha.
yeah,
They haven't been graded yet, I don't think.
okay.
So.
So it takes time. Okay,
Yeah.
I see. Okay.
Yep.
Thanks.
No problem.
Yeah, no, I was.